The most disturbing part of the apartment camera story is not that it has been proven true. It is that no reliable official source confirms it at all. That is the contradiction at the center of this case. The title sounds like a true crime discovery: an empty apartment, a camera still recording, and on the footage, a man who had supposedly been missing since 1986. It has the shape of a cold case. It has the atmosphere of a forbidden place. It seems to promise a face returning from the dead archive of the Chernobyl disaster. But when the claim is held against available research, the foundation changes. There is no confirmed police file in the material reviewed, no named missing person, no court record, no official agency statement connecting an apartment camera to a man missing since 1986. No reliable source located in this research confirms that such a recording exists, and yet the story does not feel random. It attaches itself to Pripyat, a real city in northern Ukraine near the Belarus border, only a few kilometers from the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. It attaches itself to a place where apartment doors were closed in an emergency, where families left rooms behind, where ordinary buildings became part of a restricted, radioactive landscape. It borrows weight from a real disaster so heavily documented that the silence around one unsupported claim can begin to feel like another kind of clue. That is why this chapter begins not with proof, but with the absence of proof. The claim says that an apartment camera recorded a man who had been missing since 1986. A sourced archive cannot say that happened. What it can say is that Pripyat was evacuated on 27 April 1986, the day after Reactor Unit 4 at the Chornobyl nuclear power plant was destroyed. It can say that the city became one of the most recognizable abandoned urban landscapes in the world. It can say that thousands of flats remained inside a controlled zone where access, radiation monitoring, decay, and time all changed the meaning of a locked room. The difference matters. A true crime case requires more than atmosphere. It requires a person with a name. It requires a report, an investigation, a body of records, a chain connecting a disappearance to evidence. Without that, a story may still be frightening, but it is not established fact. It becomes something else, an internet claim using the emotional architecture of a real catastrophe. Pripyat is a powerful setting for such a claim because it is not an invented ruin. It was a planned Soviet city built for the people who worked at the nearby nuclear plant and for their families. In 1986, it was part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic within the USSR. Today, it is in Ukraine. English-language archives often use Chernobyl, the older Russian-derived spelling, while Chornobyl is the Ukrainian spelling commonly used today. Both names point toward the same disaster, but the choice of spelling reminds us that this is not just a horror backdrop. It is a place with history, language, politics, and people. The verified disaster began at Reactor Unit 4 on 26 April 1986. Major nuclear safety sources describe the accident as a loss of control during an improper low-power test. The International Atomic Energy Agency describes explosions, fire, the destruction of the reactor building, and the release of radioactive material into the atmosphere. The U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission summarizes the event as a sudden power surge during a reactor systems test that destroyed Unit 4. UNSCER identifies the accident as the most serious accident to have occurred in the nuclear power industry. Those are the records that can be cited. They are not rumors. They are not found footage captions. They are the hard structure beneath every later story told about Pripyat. And within that structure is the city itself. Pripyat was evacuated on 27 April 1986. World Nuclear Association reporting states that about 45,000 residents were removed that day. International Atomic Energy Agency, urban-contamination scenario, material gives the city population at the time as up to 49,360 people. The exact figure varies by source and counting method, but the scale is clear. This was not a single building being cleared. It was a modern city emptied in the shadow of a nuclear accident. That is where the apartment camera claim finds its emotional opening. Because Pripyat was full of apartments, IAEA scenario material describes about 520,000 square meters of apartment area, roughly 13,500 flats, and up to 30,000 rooms. Those figures matter because they turn the idea of an apartment into something larger and more unsettling. There were kitchens, corridors, stairwells, bedrooms, balconies, and communal entries. There were doors behind doors, rooms facing courtyards, windows looking toward roads and public buildings. After the evacuation, that interior world remained inside a restricted landscape. The Chernobyl Exclusion Zone is commonly associated with an initial public safety perimeter described as a 30-kilometer zone around the damaged plant. Over time, the zone became a controlled territory containing abandoned apartment buildings, public buildings, roads, forests, former settlements, industrial infrastructure, contaminated sites, and wildlife habitats. Ukraine later established the Chornobyl Radiation and Ecological Biosphere Reserve in 2016, 30 years after the accident. That later designation complicates the image of the zone as merely dead or empty. It is monitored. It is restricted. It is contaminated. It is also a living environmental landscape shaped by human absence. This is what makes unsupported stories dangerous in a different way. They do not need to invent the entire world around them. They only need to place one unverified event inside a real and haunting environment. An abandoned apartment in Pripyat already carries tension. It does not need a fabricated murder, a secret resident, or a miraculous camera recording to feel charged. The factual circumstances are enough. A city was evacuated after a reactor explosion. People left homes behind. The area became restricted. Radiation danger was not always visible. Decades of looting, decay, tourism, and monitoring altered what remained. Some interior photographs and videos may show objects that were moved, staged, or disturbed long after the evacuation. A room seen today may not be a preserved moment from April 1986. It may be a layered scene, changed by time and visitors. That uncertainty is not the same as evidence for a missing man. It is evidence of why the claim feels possible. In ordinary true crime, a camera can be a stabilizing object. It records. It fixes time. It gives investigators something to examine frame by frame. But in a forbidden place story, a camera can become almost mythic. Who placed it there? Why was it still working? Who recovered it? Where is the footage archived? Which agency verified it? What missing person file does it connect to? Those questions should come before belief. In the research available here, they remain unanswered. That does not mean every mystery connected to Pripyat is false. It means the specific apartment camera claim has not been substantiated by reliable official sources located in the research. And because Pripyat is tied to real loss, the distinction is not pedantic. It is an ethical boundary. The documented Chernobyl disaster includes named institutions, dated evacuations, scientific assessments, and recorded deaths. 2 plant workers died on the night of the accident, and 28 more emergency workers or plant staff died from acute radiation syndrome in the following weeks or months, according to major nuclear safety summaries. The wider evacuations removed about 115,000 to 116,000 people from the most contaminated areas in 1986, with about 220,000 more relocated in subsequent years, according to U.S. NRC summaries citing UNSCER. Those numbers are not decorations. They are the human scale of the archive. So the first task is to separate the claim from the place. The claim is unverified. No confirmed official case has been found in which an apartment camera recorded a man missing since 1986. The place is real. Pripyat, a city built for the nuclear plant, evacuated after the destruction of Unit 4 and left with thousands of flats inside a restricted zone. The power of the title comes from forcing those two things together. An empty apartment suggests privacy interrupted. A camera suggests proof. A missing man suggests a crime or a disappearance that should have left records. 1986 gives the story a fixed historical anchor. Pripyat gives it atmosphere, danger, and silence. But when the archive is opened, the strongest evidence does not point to a confirmed cold case. It points to the city itself. To understand why the claim spread so easily, we have to understand what Pripyat was before it became a symbol. Not a ghost city first. Not a ruin by design. A living Soviet residential city, close to the plant, filled with apartment blocks, public buildings, roads, routines, families, workers, and the ordinary noise that existed before the silence. To understand the silence, we have to begin with the noise. Not the noise of alarms, helicopters, or emergency announcements. Not yet. Before Pripyat became a place people entered with dosimeters, permits, camera crews, and caution, it was a city built for ordinary life beside an extraordinary machine. Its importance to this story is not only that it was close to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. It is that it was close enough to be shaped by the plant completely, and yet, before the disaster, it was not an empty industrial outpost. It was a residential city, a planned Soviet urban space, a place of apartment blocks, public buildings, roads, and daily routines. Pripyat was the plant operator's town. It stood in northern Ukraine, in what was then the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, near the border with Belarus. The name Chornobyl is the Ukrainian spelling often used today, while Chernobyl appears in many older English-language archives and Russian-derived references. That distinction matters because the place is often remembered through outside versions of its name, through disaster media, Cold War history, and later tourist footage. But in the geography of the accident itself, Pripyat was not an abstraction. It was the nearby city where many of the plant's workers and their families lived. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant was only a few kilometers away. That distance is central. It meant the plant was not some remote facility beyond the horizon. It was part of the city's reason for existing. Workers traveled between home and the station. Families lived in apartments that were tied, directly or indirectly, to the industrial life of the nuclear complex. Public services, roads, schools, and housing existed around a modern Soviet vision of a city serving a major energy project. That is why the apartment camera claim finds such a powerful setting here. An apartment in Pripyat is not just an abandoned room. It belongs to a city whose emptiness has a known cause and a fixed historical break. When people imagine a camera left behind in a flat, they are not imagining a random ruin. They are imagining a private room inside a city that was interrupted all at once. The archive shows that Pripyat was not a city that slowly died. It did not lose its residents over decades through economic decline, rural depopulation, or ordinary urban abandonment. Its later emptiness came after a sudden evacuation following the destruction of Reactor Unit 4. That fact changes how every hallway and window is read. The city was lived in, and then, within a short emergency period, it was emptied. Before that point, Pripyat was part of the ordinary map of Soviet residential life. Its buildings were not constructed as monuments to tragedy. They were made to be used. Apartment blocks held families, workers, children, belongings, meals, conversations, arguments, sleep. Public buildings served the social and administrative life of the city. Roads connected homes to workplaces and public spaces. The city had the physical structure of continuity: stairwells, courtyards, entrances, sidewalks, service areas, corridors, and rooms arranged for everyday repetition. This is easy to forget because most images of Pripyat come from after the disaster. The later photographs show peeling paint, broken glass, empty windows, trees pushing into open spaces, and interiors altered by time, weather, looting, and visitors. Those images are real in their own period, but they are not the beginning of the story. They are the afterimage. In the beginning, Pripyat was modern. It was built as a planned urban settlement connected to one of the Soviet Union's major nuclear power projects. Its apartment landscape was large, organized, and deeply human in scale. Later IAA urban contamination scenario material would describe about 520,000 square meters of apartment area in Pripyat, with roughly 13,500 flats and up to 30,000 rooms. Those numbers belong more directly to the later chapters of this story, when we examine the apartment interiors themselves. But even here, they tell us something important. Pripyat was not a cluster of buildings. It was a complete residential environment. The future ghost city was once a city of doors. Each flat was a unit of private life inside a public system. Each stairwell connected neighbors. Each road tied domestic space to the plant, to administrative buildings, to schools, to shops, to the wider Soviet infrastructure around the nuclear station. The public and private worlds were linked. A worker could leave an apartment in Pripyat and travel only a few kilometers to one of the most significant industrial sites in the region. A family could live under the assumption that the nearby plant represented employment, progress, and stability. That assumption is part of the tragedy. Pripyat's later abandonment was not planned into its design. The city was not supposed to become a restricted landscape. Its apartments were not meant to become evidence of interruption. Its roads were not meant to lead into an exclusion zone. Its public buildings were not meant to become scenes in documentaries, video essays, or internet claims about impossible footage. When a place is abandoned slowly, time leaves a different kind of mark. Businesses close one by one. Houses empty unevenly. Roads decay after long neglect. People remember why they left in fragments. But Pripyat's silence was tied to a specific emergency chronology. The accident occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant on 26 April 1986. The city of Pripyat was evacuated on 27 April 1986. World Nuclear Association reporting states that about 45,000 Pripyat residents were evacuated that day, while IAEA scenario material gives the population at the time as up to 49,360 people. Those figures will matter more when we reach the evacuation itself. For now, what matters is what they reveal about the city before it was emptied. Tens of thousands of people were living there. This was not an abandoned zone waiting for disaster. It was a functioning city whose residents were still in place when Unit 4 was destroyed. That is the central correction to the atmosphere of the claim. The internet version begins with an empty apartment and works backward toward mystery. The record asks us to begin with a living apartment and move forward toward evacuation. That movement is quieter, but it is more accurate. It keeps the people in the story before it turns the buildings into scenery. Pripyat's later condition can make it feel as if the city always belonged to disaster. In films, photographs, and dark tourism footage, it often appears as a place outside time. Apartment blocks stand without normal residents. Public buildings sit exposed to weather and decay. Roads that once belonged to a civic plan become routes through a restricted zone. The atmosphere is powerful because the built environment remains recognizable. These are not ancient ruins where function has disappeared beyond imagination. These are modern rooms and streets, visibly close to the world we still understand. That recognition is what gives the apartment camera story its emotional force. A camera in an abandoned room feels possible because the room itself feels possible. It has walls, angles, corners, doorways, surfaces where devices could be placed. It has the shape of domestic life. It is not difficult to imagine an object left behind. It is not difficult to imagine footage being found. But imagination is not the same as documentation, and the factual power of Pripyat should not be used to smuggle in an unsupported case. The real city is already enough to explain why the claim travels. Pripyat combines intimacy and scale. One flat can feel like a private crime scene. 13,500 flats become an entire urban archive of interrupted lives. A corridor suggests secrecy. A whole apartment district suggests something larger, not one disappearance, but a mass removal from place. The silence is not only frightening because it is empty. It is frightening because it replaced a known and recent human order. The roads matter too. Forbidden places often become legends because they appear difficult to enter and difficult to verify. Pripyat later became part of the restricted Chornobyl Exclusion Zone, a controlled landscape containing abandoned urban structures, contaminated industrial sites, forests, villages, and former settlements. But before restriction, those same routes served ordinary movement. They connected workers to the Chernobyl plant. They connected residents to public spaces and homes. The transformation of those roads from civic infrastructure into controlled access routes is one of the story's quietest changes. The same is true of public buildings. In a living city, they organize community. In an evacuated city, they become evidence that the community was once there. Their emptiness can be mistaken for mystery, but the deeper story is displacement. The physical city remained visible after the people were removed. That visibility is what makes Pripyat so haunting in the archive. The structures stayed behind, but their original purpose stopped almost instantly. This is why we have to resist treating Pripyat as a supernatural stage or a generic ruin. Official and scientific sources describe a restricted, contaminated landscape with documented human, environmental, and political history. The later silence is real, but it came from an accident, emergency response, evacuation, radiation monitoring, and long-term exclusion. The emptiness has causes. The city's stillness is not unexplained, and yet explanation does not make it less disturbing. It may make it more so, because before the silence, Pripyat had the confidence of a place meant to continue. The apartments were not temporary props. The roads were not emergency corridors. The plant was part of a larger promise of modernity and power. Families lived only a few kilometers from Reactor Unit 4 because that closeness made sense inside the world that built the city. Then, in the early hours of 26 April 1986, the meaning of that closeness changed. The plant that anchored Pripyat became the source of the emergency that would empty it. The city did not yet know, in its apartments and stairwells, that the ordinary map around it had already begun to break. The ordinary map around Pripyat began to break before most residents could see it. In the apartments a few kilometers from the plant, the city still belonged to the routines of a late April night. Stairwells, courtyards, kitchens, and sleeping rooms remained part of the same residential world described earlier, a city built to serve the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, close enough for work, family life, and confidence in the industrial future that surrounded it. But at Reactor Unit 4, that closeness was becoming something else. The verified framework begins in the early hours of 26 April 1986 at the Chornobyl nuclear power plant, then in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The reactor involved was Unit 4. The accident did not begin as a mystery in an apartment, or as a missing person case, or as a piece of recovered footage. It began inside an operating nuclear facility, during a reactor systems test that official nuclear safety summaries describe in technical but unmistakable terms. The International Atomic Energy Agency describes the accident as a loss of control during an improper low-power test. The United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission describes a sudden power surge during a reactor systems test that destroyed Unit 4. These are not identical phrasings, but they point to the same verified center: a test condition, a reactor out of control, and a catastrophic failure at Unit 4. For this story, the exact language matters. It keeps the record anchored. The internet version of Pripyat often starts with dark hallways, strange noises, and impossible figures seen on camera. The official record starts somewhere more concrete, with a reactor, a test, a power condition, and a sequence of failure that move from machinery into atmosphere, from the plant into the surrounding city, and eventually into the history of nuclear power. The IAEA summary states that explosions followed the loss of control. Those explosions destroyed the reactor building and led to fire. The World Health Organization notes that explosions at Unit 4 released large quantities of radioactive materials into the atmosphere. That release is one of the crucial facts behind everything that later happened to Pripyat. The city did not become forbidden because it looked abandoned. It became abandoned because radioactive material had been released from a destroyed reactor nearby, and the risk could not be judged by sight alone. This is why the night matters so much to the later apartment story. A camera claim set inside a Pripyat flat borrows its force from the knowledge that something real and catastrophic happened just beyond the city. The apartment blocks are not frightening because they are old. They are frightening because they sit inside the consequence of a documented nuclear accident. The doors, windows, stairwells, and balconies became part of a restricted landscape only after Unit 4 was destroyed. Official summaries describe the accident in a way that resists simple dramatization. There was a low-powered test. There was a loss of control. There were explosions and fire. The reactor building was destroyed. Radioactive material entered the atmosphere. These facts are stark, but they are not folklore. They are the framework used by nuclear safety institutions to explain why Chernobyl became a defining event. UNSCER, the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, identifies the Chernobyl accident as the most serious accident to have occurred in the nuclear power industry. That description is important because it places the event beyond local disaster and beyond the boundaries of one city. Pripyat became the most recognizable abandoned urban symbol, but the accident itself affected a much wider geography through radioactive fallout, including Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and parts of wider Europe. Still, in the first hours, the crisis had a center. Reactor Unit 4. The plant. The fire, the release, the city nearby. The phrase most serious accident can become abstract if it is repeated too often. In an archive report story, it has to be brought back to what it means on the ground. A serious nuclear accident is not only an industrial failure, it changes how people understand distance. A few kilometers can become too close. An ordinary road can become an emergency route. A residential city can become a place that authorities must remove people from. A home can become an address inside a contaminated zone. That transformation did not happen all at once in public view. The night of 26 April was the beginning of a chain. The plant workers and emergency responders faced the immediate consequences at the reactor site. Major nuclear safety summaries record that 2 plant workers died on the night of the accident. They also record that 28 more emergency workers or plant staff died from acute radiation syndrome in the following weeks or months. Those figures belong later in the full accounting of the disaster, but they also show why the accident cannot be reduced to atmosphere or architecture. Before Pripyat became silent, people were already being harmed at the center of the emergency. The physical destruction of Unit 4 also created a long engineering and environmental problem. The destroyed reactor was later covered first by a Soviet-era shelter, often called the sarcophagus, and later by the new safe confinement project. Those later structures belong to the years after the accident, but they point back to the same fact. Unit 4 was not simply damaged and restarted. It was destroyed in a way that required containment over decades. This matters when we return to the apartment camera claim because it separates plausible atmosphere from proven event. Yes, Pripyat became a city of emptied interiors. Yes, the plant nearby suffered the most serious accident in the history of the nuclear power industry, according to UNSCER. Yes, radioactive material was released into the atmosphere after explosions at Unit 4, according to the World Health Organization. Those facts give the setting weight, but they do not, by themselves, prove that a camera later recorded a man missing since 1986. The disaster explains the abandonment. It does not create a missing person file where none has been found. The strongest version of this episode has to hold both truths at once. The viral claim remains unverified. The night that made the claim feel possible is verified. On 26 April 1986, Pripyat was still a living city, but the conditions that would empty it had already begun. The apartments had not yet become evidence in anyone's imagination. They were still private spaces. People still had belongings inside them. Public buildings still belonged to a functioning Soviet city. Roads still connected home to work, school, services, and the plant. But at Unit 4, the accident had already forced a different future into motion. The release of radioactive material into the atmosphere made the danger larger than the reactor building. Fire and explosion can be seen. Broken structures can be photographed. Smoke can be remembered. Radiation is different. It changes the meaning of a place without always changing its appearance. That is one reason Pripyat later became such a powerful setting for rumor. An apartment can look like a room and still belong to a disaster zone. A corridor can look empty and still be part of a controlled landscape. A city can appear frozen, as if time stopped for mysterious reasons, when the archive shows that the cause was specific, technical, and documented. The night Unit 4 was destroyed is therefore not only background, it is the hinge. Before it, Pripyat's closeness to the plant was practical. After it, closeness became risk. Before it, the city's apartment blocks were evidence of growth. After it, they would become evidence of evacuation. Before it, the plant represented the industrial purpose around which Pripyat had been built. After it, that same plant would define the city's absence. By morning, the disaster had already moved beyond the walls of Unit 4, even if ordinary life in Pripyat had not yet fully stopped. The records tell us what happened at the reactor: the improper low-power test, the loss of control, the explosions, the fire, the destroyed reactor building, and the release of radioactive material. What those records do not capture in the same immediate language is the suspended moment in the city nearby, when residents were still inside apartments that would soon become part of one of the most examined abandoned landscapes in the world. The next crucial date is 27 April 1986. That is when the consequences of the night at Unit 4 reached Pripyat not only as danger, but as removal. The accident had already happened. The release had already begun. The city that had slept near the plant would now be told to leave it behind. The city that had slept near the plant would now be told to leave it behind. That is the turn that makes 27 April 1986 so important to this story. The night at Unit 4 had already transformed the Chernobyl nuclear power plant into the center of a radiological emergency. But for Pripyat, the disaster became visible in another way, through movement, instruction, and absence. A city of apartment blocks, public buildings, roads, families, and workers was about to be emptied. The verified record is careful with this date. Pripyat was evacuated on 27 April 1986, the day after the explosion at Reactor Unit 4. World Nuclear Association reporting states that about 45,000 Pripyat residents were evacuated that day. IAEA Urban-Contamination Scenario material gives the city population at the time of the accident as up to 49,360 people. Those figures do not contradict the central fact. They show the difficulty of counting a living city at the moment it was being turned into an emergency zone. Depending on the source and the counting method, Pripyat was a city of roughly 45,000 to nearly 50,000 people. And within a short emergency window, those people were removed from the place where they lived. This matters because Pripyat was not abandoned in the way ruins are sometimes abandoned. It was not emptied slowly by economic decline, war damage, or a gradual withdrawal of services. It was not a place where people packed carefully over weeks, sold furniture, gave away possessions, and closed the door with the knowledge that they would never return. The evacuation came as a public safety response to a nuclear accident. The city's silence was produced suddenly. The apartments did not become empty because their owners had finished with them. They became empty because residents were instructed to leave. That distinction is central to the atmosphere behind the apartment camera claim. The unsupported online story asks us to imagine a recorded trace of a person from the year of the disaster. But before evaluating that kind of claim, the archive gives us something more basic and more powerful: the documented removal of an entire residential population. The real event did not need a hidden camera to be disturbing. It involved stairwells, bus routes, courtyards, kitchens, coats, documents, children, workers, and the administrative fact of evacuation. The scale was not symbolic. It was human. When World Nuclear Association reporting gives the figure of about 45,000 evacuated residents, it compresses a city into a number. IAEA scenario material, with its population figure of up to 49,360, does the same from another angle. But behind either figure is a city built around daily repetition. People had work schedules connected to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Families lived in apartments only a few kilometers from the reactor site. Children had schools and playgrounds. Public buildings had ordinary functions. Roads connected residential districts to the plant and to the wider region of northern Ukraine, near the Belarus border. On 27 April, those ordinary connections were interrupted. The interruption is important because residents did not leave apartments as museum exhibits. They left homes. A flat is not only a unit in a housing count. It is a place where a family stores clothes, documents, food, books, tools, toys, and habits. It is where a person expects to come back after a shift, after an errand, after a visit. In the emergency logic of evacuation, those expectations become unstable. The record provided here does not require us to dramatize the precise words spoken in every stairwell or the exact thoughts of every resident. It is enough to understand the larger fact: thousands of people left behind private interiors that, in many cases, they could not have understood as permanent ruins at the moment of departure. That expectation is part of why Pripyat still holds such force in public memory. Many abandoned places feel distant because they seem already separated from life. Pripyat does not. It was a modern Soviet residential city, tied to the promise and infrastructure of nuclear power. Its emptiness began with a date that can be named. 26 April was the accident at Unit 4. 27 April was the evacuation of Pripyat. The gap between those dates is short, and the consequence is immense. The city did not become famous only because buildings remained standing. It became famous because a functioning urban environment was stopped. The evacuation converted private spaces into future evidence of absence. Apartment doors, windows, balconies, stair landings, and corridors became part of a landscape that later visitors, researchers, photographers, and documentary crews would interpret through the lens of disaster. But on the day itself, those spaces were still connected to the residents who had used them. The later image of Pripyat as a forbidden city can make it feel as if it had always belonged to silence. The evacuation date corrects that impression. Silence arrived after people were removed. For a true crime-style claim, this distinction is also a safeguard. It is easy to let the emptiness of Pripyat do too much narrative work. Empty rooms invite speculation. Restricted access increases mystery. Radiation monitoring adds invisible danger. Decades of decay, looting, and later tourism complicate what any room appears to show. But the evacuation itself is not speculation. It is one of the strongest documented facts in the entire story. The city was evacuated on 27 April 1986. About 45,000 residents were removed, according to World Nuclear Association reporting. IAEA scenario material places the population as high as 49,360. Those are the boundaries of what can be said with confidence here. Inside those boundaries, the human meaning is still vast. Nearly 50,000 people is not an abstract crowd. It is enough people to fill thousands of apartments, to animate roads and public buildings, to make a planned city function. It is enough people that departure becomes a logistical operation, not a private decision. It is enough people that the emptied city afterward cannot be understood as a single crime scene, a single haunted building, or a single lost room. It is an entire urban interior world interrupted at once. That is why the later rumor of an apartment camera can feel plausible to some audiences, even without proof. The claim borrows emotional weight from the verified evacuation. If a city was emptied suddenly, then the imagination starts to ask what might have remained inside. If residents expected to return, then every abandoned object can seem like a clue. If access later became restricted, then every unseen room can seem to conceal a record. The danger is that these feelings can be mistaken for evidence. The archive supports the evacuation. It does not, from the research available here, support a confirmed case of an apartment camera recording a man missing since 1986. The better way to approach the story is to let the confirmed facts carry their own weight. On 27 April, Pripyat's residents were removed from the city built for the plant. The reason was not myth or folklore, but the consequences of the Unit 4 accident: explosions, fire, destruction of the reactor building, and the release of radioactive material into the atmosphere. The evacuation changed the meaning of every apartment block. A home became a space inside a restricted and contaminated landscape. A residential city became a forbidden place. And once the people were gone, what remained was not merely a skyline of empty buildings. It was an enormous interior map. Flats, rooms, corridors, kitchens, stairwells, and closed doors multiplied across the city. The force of the camera story comes from that real geography. Before there can be any question of a recording, a missing person, or a rediscovered image, there is the documented scale of what was left behind: thousands of private spaces, suddenly separated from the lives that had filled them. That interior map is where the claim begins to gather its atmosphere. Not from a confirmed police file, not from an official record of a camera finding a man who had been missing since 1986. The research does not establish that. The atmosphere comes from something else, something that is documented: the scale of Pripyat's residential world after the evacuation. In the IAEA urban contamination scenario material, Pripyat is not described only as a town near the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. It is measured as a city of interiors. The scenario gives about 520,000 square meters of apartment area. It describes roughly 13,500 flats. It reaches up to 30,000 rooms. Those figures matter because they change the shape of the story. A single abandoned apartment can feel like a stage. A single corridor can feel like a scene arranged for suspense. But Pripyat was not one room, one stairwell, or one building. It was a whole residential system, built for tens of thousands of people and then emptied under emergency conditions on 27 April 1986. When viewers imagine an apartment camera in Pripyat, they are not imagining it in an empty house at the edge of a forest. They are imagining it somewhere inside a vast grid of private spaces: kitchens, bedrooms, entry halls, balconies, communal landings, elevator areas, storage corners, and concrete stairwells. That is the quiet force of the setting. The city gives the rumor places to hide. A flat is intimate in a way that a reactor building is not. Reactor Unit 4 belongs to official diagrams, nuclear-safety summaries, engineering explanations, and emergency response reports. It is the center of the accident, and it must remain the center of the factual record. But an apartment belongs to another kind of memory. It suggests cups left on shelves, wallpaper, children's rooms, coats near doors, shoes in hallways, calendars, tablecloths, family photographs, and everyday objects that do not need to be dramatic to feel charged. Even when an object has been moved, looted, staged, decayed, or altered by later visitors, the apartment itself still carries the meaning of domestic interruption. Pripyat's apartments became powerful because they were not built as ruins. They were built as homes in a modern Soviet city. The evacuation did not erase that purpose. It trapped it in place. The rooms remained rooms. The kitchens remained kitchens. The corridors still connected one private threshold to another. But after the accident, those ordinary spaces were no longer part of ordinary civic life. They had crossed into a restricted landscape shaped by radioactive contamination, emergency decisions, and long-term exclusion. That change is why the apartment camera claim feels possible to some audiences, even when it remains unsupported. The mind looks at the scale and starts to fill in the unknowns. 13,500 flats means 13,500 potential doorways. Up to 30,000 rooms means an almost impossible number of corners, sightlines, surfaces, and shadows. If one person vanished from the record, the rumor suggests, could he have passed through one of those rooms? If a device was left behind, could it have recorded something years later? If a building remained standing, could an image have survived inside it? The problem is that these are emotional possibilities, not verified evidence. The archive supports the scale of the apartments. It does not support the specific camera story. That distinction is essential. Without it, the real city becomes a backdrop for invention. With it, the city becomes more serious, not less. The documented facts are already unsettling enough. 520,000 square meters of apartment area is difficult to picture because it is not a human-sized number. It belongs to planners, contamination models, and urban scale assessments. But when broken down into flats and rooms, it becomes easier to understand. Each flat had a door. Each door opened into a domestic interior. Each interior had its own pattern of movement. Someone returning from work at the plant, someone boiling water, someone putting a child to bed, someone listening for news, someone deciding what to take when evacuation buses arrived. After the evacuation, those patterns stopped. What remained was not silence in the abstract. It was silence distributed across rooms. This is one reason forbidden places hold such power in true crime storytelling. A forbidden place promises that something has been hidden from ordinary access. It suggests that records are incomplete, that doors have not been opened, that witnesses have gone away, that objects may still be waiting in darkness. In Pripyat, that feeling has a real foundation. Access became restricted because of the consequences of the Chernobyl disaster. The danger was not a legend attached to a building. It was tied to radioactive material released into the atmosphere after the destruction of Unit 4 and to the contamination histories that followed across urban surfaces, soil, vegetation, industrial sites, and abandoned settlements. But forbidden does not mean unknowable. This is the balance an archive report has to keep. Pripyat can be measured. Its evacuation date can be named. Its approximate population can be compared across sources. Its apartment stock can be described from IAEA scenario material. Its place in northern Ukraine, near the Chornobyl nuclear power plant and near the Belarus border, can be located on a map. The more carefully the city is documented, the clearer it becomes why unsupported claims attach themselves to it. Rumors often need a believable room. Pripyat offers thousands. Imagine a camera claim set in a generic abandoned building. It might sound like a ghost story, a hoax, or a fragment of internet fiction. But move that same claim into Pripyat, and the listener brings a different set of assumptions. They know, or think they know, that the city was evacuated after a nuclear accident. They know there are apartment blocks still standing. They have seen images of decayed rooms, empty schools, overgrown streets, and cracked concrete. They understand that access has been controlled. The claim borrows from that knowledge. It does not have to prove itself immediately, because the setting does some of the work. That is why the housing figures are not just background. They are part of the mechanism. A city with 13,500 flats creates narrative abundance. There are too many spaces for the viewer to hold in mind. Even if most rooms contain nothing but dust, peeling paint, and ordinary damage, the total number produces a sense of concealed possibility. The story can always point to another building, another floor, another door. It can say, perhaps it happened there. Perhaps the camera was in that unit. Perhaps the man appeared in that hallway. The scale protects the rumor from easy dismissal at the level of imagination, even while the lack of records prevents it from becoming a verified case. The real evidence asks for restraint. No reliable official source located in the research confirms an apartment security camera recording a man missing since 1986. No named missing person, police agency, case number, court record, or official archival statement is established here. What is established is the city's residential magnitude. What is established is that Pripyat's private interiors became part of the aftermath of a nuclear disaster. And that aftermath was not static. Over the decades, apartments were affected by abandonment, decay, looting, weather, and later human intrusion. Some images from Pripyat interiors may show objects moved or arranged after the evacuation. Some rooms may appear more preserved than they are. Others may look empty enough to erase the lives that once passed through them. The visual record can mislead if it is treated as untouched evidence. But the broader fact remains. These were homes, and they became inaccessible spaces inside a controlled zone. The apartment camera claim draws its tension from that collision. A camera is an object of observation. An apartment is a place of privacy. A missing person is a question of absence. Pripyat holds all three ideas in a city where absence is already visible. Empty windows line the apartment blocks. Corridors lead to doors that no longer function as normal thresholds. Stairwells still connect floors, but not neighbors in the ordinary sense. The city's residential architecture continues to suggest human presence even where the official record speaks of evacuation, restriction, and contamination. That is also why the chapter cannot treat the apartments as scenery alone. Each flat belongs to the human consequence of 27 April 1986. The figures from the IAEA material are large, but they point back to smaller facts. One household, one room, one decision about what could be carried, one assumption that leaving might be temporary. The tragedy of Pripyat's interior world is not that it became mysterious. It is that it became separated from its residents so quickly and so completely. The mystery atmosphere comes later. The forbidden place imagery comes later. The online claim comes later. First, there is the documented transformation of domestic space into abandoned, restricted space. And once that transformation is understood, the physical boundary around the story becomes more important. The apartments were not only empty, they were inside a wider geography of control. Roads, public buildings, forests, villages, industrial infrastructure, and contaminated sites were drawn into the same emergency landscape. The private rooms of Pripyat did not become forbidden one by one. They became forbidden as part of a larger zone formed around the damaged plant, a perimeter that would change how an ordinary city could be entered, studied, guarded, imagined, and feared. The boundary is where the story changes scale. Until now, the focus has been on interiors, apartments, rooms, kitchens, stairwells, and the private geography of Pripyat. But those rooms did not become inaccessible only because their residents left. They became part of a controlled landscape. The empty flat was no longer just an empty flat. It was inside a perimeter formed around the damaged reactor, inside a zone where ordinary movement was interrupted by public safety decisions, radiation concerns, and long-term restriction. That matters for the camera claim because it explains why Pripyat can feel, from a distance, like a sealed archive. The idea of footage hidden in an apartment draws power from the fact that the apartment is not simply abandoned. It belongs to a city that became difficult to enter, difficult to verify, and difficult to treat as ordinary urban space. After the accident at Reactor Unit 4 on 26 April 1986, the emergency was not confined to the reactor building. Explosions and fire had damaged the unit, and radioactive material had been released into the atmosphere. The plant itself was the origin point, but the consequences spread across inhabited land, the nearby city of Pripyat, the older town of Chernobyl, villages, roads, forests, and agricultural territory in the surrounding region. The initial public safety perimeter is commonly described as a 30-kilometer zone around the damaged plant. In plain language, that meant a circle of control, with the reactor at its center, wide enough to include not only industrial ground, but whole communities. A nuclear accident had turned a familiar map into an emergency map. Distances that once meant commuting, bus routes, family visits, and supply roads now meant exposure risk, evacuation planning, checkpoints, monitoring, and exclusion. The phrase 30-kilometer zone can sound abstract. It may seem like a line drawn on a document, a measurement chosen by officials far from the streets themselves. But inside that measurement were homes, schools, administrative buildings, apartment blocks, footpaths, garages, playgrounds, service roads, and forests. It was not empty land waiting to be closed. It was lived-in territory that had to be reclassified. That is one of the most important transformations in the history of Pripyat. The city did not become forbidden because it had been forgotten. It became forbidden because it was remembered as dangerous. Its roads still led somewhere. Its buildings still stood. Its apartments still had doors and windows, but access to them was no longer governed by the routines of residents. It was governed by the logic of contamination, state authority, emergency response, and later, controlled entry. The Chornobyl Exclusion Zone, as it later became known, was more than the evacuated city. It became a restricted landscape containing abandoned urban structures, contaminated industrial sites, forests, villages, roads, and wildlife habitats. The name itself can make the place sound singular, as if it were one fenced ruin. In reality, it held layers of human and environmental history. There was the nuclear plant and its damaged Unit 4. There was Pripyat, the purpose-built plant operator's town, only a few kilometers away. There was the older town of Chernobyl. There were former settlements and roads that had once connected ordinary places to one another. Within that landscape, Pripyat became the most recognizable symbol because it preserved the shape of a modern city without the life of one. Apartment blocks remained visible. Public buildings remained visible. Streets and open squares remained visible, but their meaning had changed. A stairwell was no longer just a stairwell. It was part of a restricted building in a restricted city inside a contaminated zone. This is why the forbidden place category attaches so easily to Pripyat. It is not merely that entry was limited. It is that the restriction fell over spaces designed for normal life. A plant or a military installation may already feel separate from ordinary experience. But an apartment block is familiar. A corridor is familiar. A kitchen is familiar. The disturbance comes from seeing those familiar forms placed behind a boundary. The boundary also changed the status of evidence. In an ordinary missing person story, investigators and families may return to a home, search rooms, examine objects, interview neighbors, and reconstruct movements through known streets. In Pripyat, after evacuation, access itself became a special condition. The abandoned apartments were not freely searchable domestic spaces. They were located inside a zone defined by contamination and control. Any later claim about a recording found there has to pass through that reality. It is not enough for a story to say that a camera was in an apartment. The question becomes, who entered the apartment, when, under what authority, with what equipment, and how is the material preserved or documented? The restricted character of the zone makes the story more atmospheric, but it also raises the evidentiary threshold. A place that is difficult to access may produce rumors more easily than records. It may make a claim feel possible while making verification harder. That tension is central to this episode. The exclusion zone gives the camera story its setting, but it does not prove the camera story. The verified history tells us that Pripyat's apartments were emptied after the Unit 4 accident. It tells us that the city lay within a broader, restricted landscape. It tells us that the zone included roads, public structures, forests, villages, industrial infrastructure, and contaminated sites. It does not, by itself tell us that an apartment camera recorded a missing man. Still, the boundary helps explain why that unsupported claim can travel so well. Forbidden spaces invite speculation because access is limited and imagination fills the gaps. When a city is open, its rooms can be checked, visited, sold, repaired, demolished, or occupied. When a city is restricted, rooms become distant even if they are physically intact. A hallway that might once have carried neighbors and children becomes an image from a controlled territory. A door becomes a threshold, not just into a flat, but into a place most people are not allowed to enter without permission. Over time, the zone's meaning continued to evolve. The destroyed Unit 4 was covered first by a Soviet-era shelter, often called the sarcophagus, and later by the new safe confinement project. These structures belong to an engineering response focused on the reactor site itself. Around them, the wider landscape remained marked by evacuation, monitoring, abandonment, and changing environmental conditions. 30 years after the accident, in 2016, Ukraine established the Chernobyl Radiation and Ecological Biosphere Reserve. That institution complicates the simple image of the zone as only dead or ruined. The restricted territory also became a place of ecological observation, a monitored landscape where forests, former settlements, and wildlife habitats exist alongside the history of disaster. The zone is therefore not only a backdrop for fear, it is a layered place, damaged, studied, restricted, abandoned in some ways, active in others. This complexity matters because Pripyat is often flattened into a single image, an empty apartment, a broken window, a corridor, a piece of furniture, a room said to be untouched. But the city sits inside a much larger administrative and environmental reality. Its interiors are connected to access rules, radiation monitoring, cleanup histories, looting, decay, tourism, and official control. A room may look like a still photograph from 1986, but the zone around it has never been still. The 30-kilometer boundary also reminds us that the disaster did not stop at Pripyat. The wider evacuations in 1986 removed about 115,000 to 116,000 people from the most contaminated areas, depending on the source and counting method. In later years, about 220,000 more people were relocated from contaminated areas, according to summaries citing UNSCER. These figures place Pripyat's evacuation within a larger pattern of displacement. The city is iconic, but it was not the only affected community. For the people who left, the boundary did not mean mystery. It meant separation. It meant homes that could no longer be entered in the ordinary sense. It meant villages and roads placed behind restriction. It meant the transformation of local geography into a controlled map. For outsiders, decades later, the boundary can appear almost cinematic. But for those displaced by the accident, it was a practical and permanent rupture. This is where the apartment story must be handled carefully. The restricted zone gives the claim a powerful emotional setting. It makes it easy to imagine hidden evidence, forgotten devices, rooms sealed by danger, and a past waiting inside concrete walls. But the archive teaches a different discipline. It asks what can be shown, what can be dated, what can be attributed, and what remains only a story shaped by the atmosphere of a real place. Pripyat's homes became forbidden, not because they were haunted, and not because they belonged to a confirmed true crime mystery. They became forbidden because a nuclear accident changed the rules of the landscape around them. The city's ordinary architecture was absorbed into an emergency perimeter and then into a long-term exclusion regime. The same apartment blocks that had once held routine domestic life became part of a territory defined by restricted access and contamination. And contamination is the point that brings us closer to the rooms themselves. From the outside, an apartment may look like an abandoned interior. Walls, dust, floor, metal, glass, furniture, and open doorways. But in the Chernobyl story, visible surfaces do not tell the whole truth. The danger that turned Pripyat into restricted space was not always something the eye could identify. It could settle unevenly, remain in dust, cling to soil, gather in moss, or differ from one building material to another. To understand why these rooms cannot be treated as ordinary ruins, the boundary is only the beginning. The next layer is invisible. The invisible layer changes the way every room has to be read. A Pripyat apartment can appear in a photograph or a video like a familiar abandoned place. There may be wallpaper coming loose from a wall. There may be a radiator under a window, a cupboard door hanging open, a floor covered with plaster, glass, and dust. The scene has the visual grammar of urban decay. But the Chornobyl Exclusion Zone is not only a place where buildings aged without residents. It is a place where radioactive material was released into the atmosphere after the destruction of Reactor Unit 4, and where contamination became part of the physical story of streets, soil, roofs, rooms, and surfaces. That is why the apartment camera claim cannot be treated as if it belongs in an ordinary derelict building. The setting itself carries a different kind of evidence. The danger is not limited to what is broken, flooded, dark, or unstable. It may not announce itself at all. A room can look quiet and still be part of a contaminated landscape. A wall can look like a wall. Dust can look like dust. Moss can look like moss. But in Chernobyl literature, the problem is precisely that radioactive contamination does not need to look unusual to matter. The major scientific and nuclear safety summaries describe the accident at Unit 4 as a release of radioactive material into the atmosphere. The World Health Organization notes that explosions at Unit 4 released large quantities of radioactive materials. Chornobyl literature discusses radionuclides, including iodine-131 and cesium-137. Those names matter because they remind us that the disaster did not end at the visible edge of the reactor building, or even at the first security boundary. Material moved outward. It entered the emergency geography around the plant. It became part of why Pripyat was evacuated, why the wider zone was restricted, and why later access required control, monitoring, and caution. In a conventional abandoned apartment block, the hazards are usually structural and obvious enough to imagine. Floors may be weak. Stairwells may be damaged. Glass may cut. Ceilings may collapse. Damp may rot the interior. In Pripyat, all of those ordinary hazards can still exist, but they are not the whole picture. Radiation monitoring matters because contamination can be uneven. It can vary across a district, across a building, and even across the surfaces inside and around a room. One place may be comparatively less contaminated, while another, only a short distance away, carries a different history of deposition, disturbance, or accumulation. This unevenness is one reason the interiors resist simple horror framing. The camera story version of Pripyat often imagines the apartment as a stage. A door opens, a lens records, a figure appears. But the real rooms are not only stages. They are surfaces in a monitored zone. They are places where dust may have been stirred by time, weather, looting, visitors, animals, or decay. They are connected to stairwells, basements, roofs, courtyards, soil, and vegetation. They are not sealed boxes preserving a single moment from April 1986. They have had decades of contamination history and decades of physical change. A wall in one flat may have been shielded from direct exposure. A windowsill may have collected dust. A balcony may have been open to rain, wind, and material from outside. A stairwell may have become a channel for movement through the building. A basement may have its own moisture, sediment, and debris. Metal surfaces may have different contamination behavior from plaster, fabric, wood, or soil. Moss outside a building may record a different environmental story than the painted surface of an interior corridor. These distinctions are not decorative details. They are why official and scientific discussion treats the zone as a complex, contaminated landscape rather than a simple abandoned city. The same is true of routes through the city. A person entering an apartment does not only enter a room. They travel over roads, through courtyards, past vegetation, across thresholds, along stairs, and into spaces where dust and debris have accumulated. The path matters. So does the season, the weather, and the disturbance of surfaces. The exclusion zone contains abandoned apartment buildings, public buildings, roads, forests, former settlements, and industrial infrastructure. Each of those environments can have its own contamination history. The danger is not evenly painted over the map. It is patterned by the accident, the emergency response, the cleanup work, time, decay, and environmental movement. This is also why Pripyat's emptiness can be misleading on screen. A camera can show silence very well. It can show a corridor stretching into shadow. It can show wallpaper, broken furniture, and a window looking toward trees. but it cannot, by itself, show whether a patch of dust, soil, moss, or metal has a higher or lower contamination level. Without measurement, the image remains incomplete. The viewer sees a room. The archive reminds us that the room belongs to a restricted zone created after the most serious accident in the history of the nuclear power industry, as UNSCERA identifies it. The apartments therefore carry two kinds of invisibility. The first is human absence, the missing residents, the evacuated families, the lives interrupted on 27 April 1986. The second is physical invisibility, contamination that may not change the appearance of a surface. These two invisibilities can easily be confused in storytelling. One produces emotion, the other produces risk. Together, they make the rooms powerful, but they also make them easy to sensationalize. That distinction is important for a true crime-style claim. If someone says a camera recorded a man missing since 1986, the mind may jump to the image itself. Who placed the camera? Where was it mounted? What did it capture? Was the figure alive, lost, hiding, or misidentified? But before those questions can be answered, the location has to be understood correctly. A Pripyat apartment is not neutral scenery. It is part of a restricted, contaminated environment. Any supposed footage from inside such a place would need context: when it was recorded, by whom, under what access conditions, with what radiation monitoring, in which building, on which route, and with what chain of custody. The absence of visible danger is part of the reason unsupported stories can thrive. A room looks enterable. A hallway looks still. A doorway looks like an invitation. The image does not explain the history of iodine 131, cesium 137, evacuation, relocation, exclusion, or monitoring. It simply shows an interior. Viewers fill the silence with mystery, but the official record gives that silence a different meaning. It is not only atmospheric. It is administrative, environmental, and scientific. It is the silence of a city removed from ordinary use, because ordinary use was no longer safe. This does not mean every point in Pripyat is equally dangerous, or that every photograph implies the same level of risk. The research notes do not support that kind of simple statement. They point instead to the need for caution. Contamination histories differ, and monitoring matters. Walls, dust, soil, moss, basements, and metal surfaces may not tell the same story. That complexity is exactly what separates the real exclusion zone from a haunted house version of it. A haunted house is usually built on visible cues: darkness, decay, isolation, a locked room. Pripyat has those cues, but it also has something quieter and more difficult, a danger that may exist without any visual drama at all. There is another layer here as well. Over the decades, some interiors have been looted, altered, staged, or disturbed by visitors. The research cautions against assuming every object remains exactly where residents left it in April 1986. That matters because contamination and interpretation both depend on history. A doll placed on a bed for a photograph is not the same kind of evidence as an untouched room. A camera left by a visitor is not the same as an official monitoring device. A video clip without provenance is not the same as a police file, a court record, or an archival document. In Pripyat, the visual field can be compelling and still fail to prove what the story claims. The rooms ask for a slower kind of attention. They have to be seen as domestic spaces, abandoned spaces, restricted spaces, and contaminated spaces all at once. A kitchen is not only a kitchen. It is part of an apartment block within a city evacuated after the Unit 4 explosion. A stairwell is not only a route between floors. It is a surface system of concrete, paint, dust, metal railings, broken glass, and air movement inside a long empty building. A basement is not only a darker level below ground. It may have a different relationship to water, debris, and contamination than an upper floor. Even the most ordinary materials become part of the record. This is where the archive begins to matter more than the atmosphere. The atmosphere can tell us why the claim feels plausible. It cannot tell us whether the claim is true. The invisible danger in visible rooms teaches the same lesson in another form. Appearance is not evidence. A room may look safe and not be safe. A video may look convincing and not be verified. A place may look like a mystery and still require documentation before it becomes a case. So when we return to the apartment camera story, the question is not only what the camera supposedly saw, it is what can be supported outside the frame. The documented record can take us a long way, to the accident at Unit 4, to the evacuation of Pripyat, to the scale of the apartment blocks, to the restricted zone, to the relocation of people from contaminated areas, and to the confirmed deaths recorded in major nuclear safety summaries. But the same record also draws a boundary around what can be responsibly claimed. In a landscape where danger itself may be invisible, the evidence has to be even more visible. If the last chapter was about invisible danger, this one is about visible evidence. Not the kind that appears in a single frame or in a caption under a dark video, but the kind that can be followed across records, dates, places, institutions, evacuation figures, documented deaths, and official summaries that can be compared against one another. That distinction matters here because the apartment camera claim asks for trust. It asks the viewer to believe that, somewhere inside the abandoned residential world of Pripyat, a camera recorded a man who had been missing since 1986. It sounds like a true crime discovery. It sounds like a lost case suddenly reopened by a piece of footage. But an archive report has to begin with a narrower question. Not whether the story feels possible, not whether the setting makes it feel plausible. The question is what the record can actually prove. The archive can prove that the central disaster was real, specific, and dated. The accident occurred on 26 April 1986 at Reactor Unit 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, then in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Major nuclear safety summaries describe the event as a loss of control during an improper low-power test, followed by explosions, fire, destruction of the reactor building, and the release of radioactive material into the atmosphere. The U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission describes a sudden power surge during a reactor systems test that destroyed Unit 4. UNCER identifies Chernobyl as the most serious accident to have occurred in the nuclear power industry. Those records do not need atmosphere to make them frightening. They are not built from rumor. They come from institutions whose work is to describe accidents, radiation exposure, emergency response, and long-term consequences. The language is technical and sometimes restrained, but the outline is severe. A reactor destroyed, a building damaged, radioactive material released, a nearby city placed in danger. The archive can also prove that Pripyat was not an invented backdrop. It was the plant operator's town, located only a few kilometers from the Chernobyl plant in northern Ukraine near the Belarus border. In 1986, it was a modern Soviet city tied closely to the nuclear station and to the workers, families, and services that supported it. Its later emptiness is not a mood created for photographs. It came from an emergency evacuation after the Unit 4 accident. That evacuation is also documented. Pripyat was evacuated on 27 April 1986, the day after the explosion. World Nuclear Association reporting gives the figure as about 45,000 residents removed from the city that day. IAEA Urban Hondialan Contamination Scenario Material gives the population at the time of the accident as up to 49,360 people. The slight difference in figures does not weaken the underlying fact. It shows the ordinary problem of counting people under different definitions and source methods. But both figures point to the same reality. An entire city was emptied under emergency conditions. This is one reason the apartment camera story finds such easy ground online. The city was not abandoned slowly. It did not fade away over generations, with houses collapsing one by one and families leaving over time. Its abandonment is tied to a known date. Apartments that had been part of normal life became, almost overnight, rooms inside a restricted and contaminated landscape. That single transition gives the setting a rare force. It allows people to imagine a before and after with unusual clarity, a kitchen before evacuation, a kitchen after, a hallway before the buses, a hallway after, a flat that still looks domestic but no longer belongs to daily life. The archive can also support the scale of that interior world. IAEA Urban Contamination Scenario Material describes Pripyat as having about 520,000 square meters of apartment area, roughly 13,500 flats, and up to 30,000 rooms. These figures matter because they prevent the story from shrinking into one symbolic apartment. Pripyat's residential geography was vast. There were many stairwells, many corridors, many doors, many kitchens, many windows looking out over roads and courtyards. A claim about a camera in an apartment draws power from that scale. It is easy to imagine that one room among so many could hide a secret. It is easy to imagine that one device, one corner, one forgotten interior could preserve something no one expected to see. But scale is not the same as confirmation. Thousands of flats make a story imaginable. They do not make it documented. The archive can also prove that the space around Pripyat became restricted. After the accident, an initial public safety perimeter is commonly described as a 30-kilometer zone around the damaged plant. Over time, the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone became a restricted landscape containing abandoned apartment buildings, public structures, roads, forests, villages, contaminated industrial sites, and wildlife habitats. The nearby town of Chornobyl, older than Pripyat, also lay within the restricted zone after the accident. This is another part of the record that gives the camera claim its atmosphere. Restricted territory changes how people imagine evidence. A locked or controlled place can feel like a container for secrets. If access is limited, the mind fills the distance with possibility. But again, the archive asks for a separation. Restricted access can explain why a place became difficult to enter. It does not prove that a missing person case unfolded there. It does not identify a man. It does not authenticate footage. It does not connect an apartment camera to an official investigation. The archive can prove the wider human displacement as well. NRC and UNSCEER or IAEA linked figures describe about 115,000 to 116,000 people evacuated in 1986 from the most contaminated areas. The U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission summary, citing UNCER, describes a further 220,000 people relocated in subsequent years from contaminated areas. These figures widen the story beyond Pripyat. They show that the accident did not only empty one city. It altered a broader region across contaminated territory, with consequences for communities, families, housing, health monitoring, and memory. Here, too, the record is strong. It supports evacuation. It supports relocation. It supports the transformation of ordinary settlements into controlled or abandoned places. What it does not do is convert every later mystery attached to the zone into fact. The archive can also support a specific and sobering death toll from the immediate accident period, as described in major nuclear safety summaries. 2 plant workers died on the night of the accident. 28 more emergency workers or plant staff died from acute radiation syndrome in the following weeks or months. These deaths are part of the documented human cost of Unit 4. They are not internet embellishment. They belong to the official record of the disaster's immediate consequences. That point has to be handled carefully. The Chernobyl disaster produced many forms of suffering, and long-term health effect estimates are complex. Major bodies such as WHO, UNSCERA, IAEA, and the NRC describe different aspects of exposure, risk, and consequence. But for this chapter's purpose, the immediate recorded deaths matter because they show what documentation looks like when an event is supported. There are categories. There are time frames. There are institutions. There are descriptions that can be traced and compared. By contrast, the apartment camera missing man claim does not have that structure in the provided research. No reliable official source located confirms that an apartment security camera recorded a man who had been missing since 1986. The research does not provide a named missing person. It does not provide a police agency. It does not provide a case number. It does not provide a court record, an official archival record, or a credible agency statement tying a piece of apartment footage to a man missing from the year of the evacuation. That absence does not prove that no rumor was ever told, or that no video was ever posted, or that no visitor ever claimed to see something strange in a Pripyat interior. The zone has accumulated decades of stories, photographs, tourism footage, staged images, altered rooms, looting, decay, and speculation. But a true crime claim requires more than a setting capable of carrying fear. It requires a chain of evidence. This is where the archive becomes both useful and limiting. It can take us very far into the real history of the place. It can tell us when Unit 4 was destroyed. It can tell us when Pripyat was evacuated. It can estimate how many residents left. It can describe how many flats and rooms formed the residential landscape. It can identify the restricted zone and the broader relocation of people from contaminated areas. It can name the immediate categories of recorded deaths after the accident. But it cannot, based on the research in hand, prove the apartment camera case promised by the claim. The strongest documented story remains the real disaster and the real evacuation, not a confirmed missing man revelation hidden in footage. That may feel less dramatic than the title suggests, but it is more important. In a place like Pripyat, the facts are already heavy. They do not need to be inflated into unsupported true crime to matter. The empty apartments are not evidence of every story told about them. They are evidence of one enormous documented rupture, a city evacuated after the destruction of Unit 4, then held inside a restricted landscape shaped by contamination, memory, and control. So the question begins to narrow. If someone wants the apartment camera claim to stand as more than a rumor, the burden shifts. The setting has been verified. The disaster has been verified. The evacuation has been verified. The scale of the rooms has been verified. The missing man case has not. What remains is not atmosphere, but paperwork, the name, the file, the agency, the record, and the source that would connect a face and a frame to a person lost since 1986. That is where the claim becomes less cinematic and more procedural. A room can be photographed. A corridor can be filmed. A frame can be paused and enlarged. But if the story is that a camera recorded a man missing since 1986, then the image is only the beginning. It is not the proof by itself. The proof would have to live around the image, in records that identify the person, establish the disappearance, and connect the recording to a credible chain of evidence. That is the first thing the claim needs and does not have: a name. A confirmed true crime case does not usually begin with a man. It begins with a person who can be identified. A family name, a given name, a date of birth, if available, a last known address, a known workplace, a known evacuation status. In the context of Pripyat, those details would matter even more because the city was not an ordinary crime scene. It was a plant operator's town near the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, evacuated after the destruction of Reactor Unit 4. Its residents were moved out under emergency conditions on 27 April 1986. The wider disaster produced enormous human displacement, and the administrative records around that displacement would not be a small detail. They would be central. If a man truly had been missing since that year, and if later footage from an apartment camera had been connected to him, the basic question would be simple: who was he? Without that name, the claim remains almost impossible to test. It cannot be checked against a missing person notice. It cannot be compared with evacuation records. It cannot be connected to a family statement, an official appeal, or a police inquiry. It cannot be separated from thousands of other possible stories inside the same setting. Pripyat had approximately 45,000 to 49,360 residents at the time of the accident, depending on the source and counting method. That scale is part of why the city feels so haunting, but it also means that any individual claim requires individual evidence. The larger the tragedy, the more dangerous it becomes to let an unnamed figure stand in for a documented person. The second missing element is a file. If the premise is true crime, there should be a case structure. Not necessarily a complete public archive, and not necessarily every document released in full, but some trace of an official process. A police file, a case number, a court record, a statement from a credible agency, an archival reference that can be examined beyond the social media caption or the retold version of the story. The research notes for this episode found no reliable official source confirming that an apartment security camera recorded a man who had been missing since 1986. That absence matters because the claim is not just saying that someone saw a strange figure in an abandoned apartment. It is saying that the figure was identified as a person missing for decades. Identification is an evidentiary act. It requires comparison. It requires a record of who was missing. It requires a basis for saying that the person in the footage is not merely unknown, but specifically connected to a disappearance dating back to the year of the Chernobyl accident. A vague clip, even if it existed, would not do that work alone. A third missing element is the camera itself as an object in the chain of evidence. What kind of camera was it? Who installed it? When was it installed? In which apartment building? Under whose authority? Was it part of security monitoring, research, maintenance, tourism control, or something else? Was the footage original, copied, compressed, edited, reposted, or narrated over? Who first obtained it? Who preserved it? Who authenticated the date and location? These questions may feel technical, but in an archive report-style investigation, they are not distractions. They are the route back to the truth. Pripyat's apartment blocks exist inside a restricted landscape, not a normal residential district. Access is controlled and has changed over time. The Chornobyl Exclusion Zone contains abandoned urban structures, contaminated industrial sites, forests, villages, roads, and infrastructure. In such a place, a camera has to be placed by someone, maintained by someone, recovered by someone, and interpreted by someone. If the recording is supposed to carry true crime weight, then the camera cannot remain a prop in the story. It has to become evidence, and evidence has a history. The fourth missing element is an official bridge between the supposed footage and the supposed missing man. Even if there were a named missing person, and even if there were a real apartment camera, those two facts would not automatically belong together. The connection would need to be made by someone with access to records or investigative authority, a police agency, a court, a recognized archive, a credible public institution, a documented family identification, handled carefully and supported by other material, might also become part of the picture. But the connection cannot simply be assumed because the story is emotionally satisfying. This is especially important in Pripyat because the setting is powerful enough to make weak evidence feel stronger than it is. The city already carries the weight of a verified rupture. Reactor Unit 4 was destroyed on 26 April 1986 after a loss of control during an improper low-power test, followed by explosions, fire, destruction of the reactor building, and the release of radioactive material into the atmosphere. Pripyat was evacuated the next day. About 13,500 flats and up to 30,000 rooms became part of an abandoned interior landscape. The initial public safety boundary is commonly described as a 30-kilometer zone around the damaged plant. Later, the exclusion zone became a restricted territory of empty buildings, roads, forests, former settlements, and monitored contamination. Those facts do not make the camera claim true, but they make it feel possible. That is the emotional trap. The mind sees an abandoned apartment and already knows that something real happened there. Not a legend, not a fictional haunting, a documented evacuation, a city interrupted. Families leaving kitchens, corridors, stairwells, and rooms under emergency conditions. When a new claim enters that space, it borrows from the authority of the setting. The room is real, so the story attached to the room begins to feel real. The evacuation was real, so a missing person premise feels like it might be one more hidden consequence. The silence of the buildings becomes a kind of invitation to imagine what the archive has not said. But silence is not confirmation. In fact, silence in the record can mean several things, and a responsible investigation has to resist choosing the most dramatic explanation first. It may mean that no such case exists. It may mean the story has been altered from another source. It may mean that footage from an abandoned building was miscaptioned. It may mean that a fictional or staged premise was absorbed into the language of documentary true crime. It may mean that the identity of a figure in a video was never established at all. Without a named person, an agency, a file, or an authenticated recording, there is no reliable way to move from possibility to fact. The setting also complicates visual evidence. Some photos and videos of Pripyat interiors have been staged, moved, looted, or altered by visitors over time. That does not mean every image is false. It means the condition of a room cannot automatically be read as untouched evidence from April 1986. Objects can be shifted. Doors can be opened. Furniture can be rearranged. Personal items can be taken, returned, posed, or photographed out of context. In a place shaped by looting, decay, tourism, access restrictions, and radiation monitoring, the visual record has its own history of disturbance. So if an apartment camera recording is presented as decisive, it must answer more than what appears in the frame. It must answer where the frame came from. The absence of official confirmation is not a minor footnote. It is the dividing line between a documented mystery and an internet claim set inside a documented place. True crime depends on that line. When the line is blurred, real people become atmosphere. Disaster becomes decoration. An abandoned city becomes a stage onto which any story can be projected, no matter how thinly supported. Pripyat does not need that treatment. Its history is already severe. The archive can show the accident, the evacuation, the scale of residential abandonment, the establishment of restricted territory, the wider relocation from contaminated areas, and the deaths recorded in major nuclear safety summaries. It can show enough to explain why the city remains one of the most recognizable forbidden places in modern history. What it cannot show, based on the research available here, is a verified case in which an apartment camera recorded a man missing since 1986. That conclusion may feel less dramatic than the claim, but it is more honest, and in this setting, honesty carries its own gravity. The empty apartments are not empty because a rumor made them interesting. They are empty because a real technological disaster forced a city out of its rooms. And that is why the claim survives so easily, even without the missing records. It does not appear in a neutral place. It attaches itself to corridors that already feel unfinished, to flats already cut off from ordinary time, to a restricted landscape already marked by danger and absence. The paperwork is missing, but the atmosphere is abundant. And when a story has that much atmosphere behind it, belief can begin before evidence ever arrives. That is the point where belief begins to move differently. Not through a document, not through a verified case file, and not through an official statement, but through recognition. A viewer sees a room in Pripyat and already knows, or thinks they know, what kind of place it is. The walls do not have to explain themselves. The corridor does not have to prove it is abandoned. The city has already entered public memory as a place where ordinary life was interrupted with almost no warning. That is why the apartment camera story feels believable, even when the specific claim remains unsupported. It borrows from a verified disaster. It stands inside a real evacuation. It uses the architecture of an actual city whose residents were removed after the destruction of Reactor Unit 4 at the Chornobyl nuclear power plant. The claim does not need to invent the silence of Pripyat. The silence is already there. The mechanism is simple but powerful. A false or unverified story can feel convincing when it is placed inside a true setting that is already emotionally charged. Pripyat supplies that setting in an unusually concentrated form. It was not an empty ruin before the accident. It was a modern Soviet city, built near the plant, full of apartment blocks, public buildings, roads, schools, and daily routines. Then, after the accident, on 26 April 1986, the city was evacuated on 27 April 1986. The date is precise. The place is precise. The cause is documented. That precision gives the surrounding atmosphere an authority of its own. The unsupported camera claim leans on that authority. It says, in effect, imagine one more unknown event inside a place where something terrible is already known to have happened. And because the known event was so large, the extra invention can seem smaller than it is. A man missing since 1986. A camera in an apartment. A face appearing after decades. In another city, the story might sound thin immediately. In Pripyat, the same story arrives surrounded by abandoned buildings, restricted roads, radiation monitoring, and the memory of residents leaving homes they did not understand as permanent ruins. The scale matters here. The research record does not describe one building, or one sealed room, or one isolated block. IAEA Urban Contamination Scenario. Material describes about 520,000 square meters of apartment area in Pripyat, roughly 13,500 flats, and up to 30,000 rooms. Those figures change the imagination. They create a city of interiors. Kitchens, entryways, balconies, stairwells, bedrooms, storage spaces, and corridors. When a rumor speaks of a camera inside an apartment, it does not have to build its world from nothing. There are thousands of possible rooms for the listener to picture. That abundance creates a strange kind of plausibility. The more rooms there are, the easier it becomes to imagine that something could have been overlooked. The longer the corridors, the easier it becomes to imagine an unnoticed figure at the far end. The more buildings stand inside restricted territory, the easier it becomes to imagine evidence waiting behind a door. This is not proof. It is spatial persuasion. The setting itself begins to argue before the evidence appears. Forbidden places often work this way in public imagination. Access is limited, so knowledge feels incomplete. Roads are controlled, so distance becomes part of the mystery. Buildings are visible in photographs and videos, but not freely entered by most people. That mixture of visibility and restriction is especially powerful. Pripyat is not hidden in the ordinary sense. Images of it have circulated for years through documentaries, dark tourism material, news features, and historical programs. But the city still belongs to a restricted landscape shaped by contamination, state control, monitoring, and the legacy of disaster. It can be seen, but not simply possessed. It can be filmed, but not treated like an ordinary abandoned neighborhood. That tension helps a weak claim survive. If a viewer cannot easily check the apartment, cannot walk the route, cannot compare the hallway, cannot ask the former residents, and cannot search the local records directly, then the story gains room to breathe. The restricted character of the exclusion zone does not prove the story true, but it makes verification feel distant. And when verification feels distant, atmosphere can begin to fill the gap. There is also the problem of real horror. The Chernobyl disaster does not need embellishment to be disturbing. Major nuclear safety summaries identify the accident as the most serious in the history of the nuclear power industry. The destruction of Unit 4, the explosions, the fire, and the release of radioactive material into the atmosphere are documented. The evacuation of Pripyat is documented. The removal of people from contaminated areas is documented. The deaths of workers and emergency responders from the immediate crisis are documented. These facts give the place a moral weight that fictional horror often tries to imitate. The apartment camera claim attaches itself to that weight. It takes the authentic horror of sudden displacement and reframes it as a mystery of personal survival, disappearance, or return. That is why it can feel emotionally coherent even when it is evidentially empty. The city was emptied. People did leave apartments behind. The zone did become restricted. Decades did pass. Rooms did remain. Those statements are true. The unsupported claim then adds a final step, that a camera recorded a missing man from that original rupture. The added step is not supported by the available research, but it is placed so close to verified facts that it can seem to inherit their credibility. This is one of the quiet dangers of archive-style storytelling. Real records can become a backdrop for invented certainty. A narrator can name Pripyat, Chornobyl, Reactor Unit 4, 26 April 1986, and 27 April 1986, and the listener may feel that the next sentence carries the same documentary force. But each claim has to be earned separately. The accident has sources. The evacuation has sources. The apartment scale has sources. The restricted zone has sources. The missing man recording does not, based on the research available here. Still, the emotional response is understandable. Pripyat is built for unfinished questions because its abandonment was not natural. It did not slowly empty as industries failed or population shifted over generations. It was interrupted. That interruption is visible in the way people talk about the city: flats left behind, public buildings emptied, roads leading into controlled territory, ordinary spaces converted into evidence of an emergency. The mind tries to complete what was broken. It asks who left, who returned, what was forgotten, what remained locked away, and whether any person was lost, not only in the records, but inside the geography itself. The camera is a particularly effective object in that imagination. A camera suggests evidence without requiring explanation. It promises a mechanical witness, something less emotional than memory and less corruptible than rumor. In true crime language, footage often feels decisive. A frame can be paused. A face can be compared. A timestamp can be read. But in this case, the necessary supporting structure is absent. There is no confirmed named missing person in the research notes, no police file, no court record, no credible agency statement connecting an apartment camera to a man missing since 1986. Without that structure, the camera remains a storytelling device, not a verified witness. The forbidden place atmosphere makes that device even stronger. In an ordinary apartment building, a camera raises practical questions. Who installed it? When? Why was it still operating? Who recovered the footage? Which agency handled it? Where's the file? In Pripyat, those questions can be softened by mood. The viewer may not ask them immediately because the setting already feels exceptional. The city seems to suspend normal rules, but the suspension is emotional, not evidentiary. Restricted territory does not make unsupported footage more credible. Radiation danger does not replace identification. Abandoned rooms do not create a missing person case by themselves. The same is true of silence. Silence can be meaningful in a documentary, but it is not always evidence of concealment. Sometimes silence means records are missing from the storyteller's research. Sometimes it means a claim began online without a traceable source. Sometimes it means an image was detached from its original context and given a stronger caption than it deserved. In a place like Pripyat, silence feels heavier because the city itself is quiet. But the quiet of a building and the absence of documentation are not the same thing. This is why the story feels believable. It is built from real components arranged around an unverified center. The disaster is real. The evacuation date is real. The apartment blocks are real. The restricted zone is real. The long corridors, empty public buildings, and controlled roads belong to a documented landscape. The emotional truth of sudden displacement is real. What remains unsupported is the particular bridge from that landscape to a recorded man missing since 1986. Understanding that mechanism does not make Pripyat less haunting. If anything, it makes the place more serious. The city does not need an unproven camera story to hold attention. Its documented history already contains the force of an emergency that moved tens of thousands of residents out of their homes and transformed a living urban space into a monitored exclusion landscape. The responsibility is to let that history speak without allowing atmosphere to do the work of evidence. And atmosphere has had decades to gather. After evacuation, the rooms did not remain frozen in a perfect state. Buildings aged. Objects moved. Access changed. Looting, decay, tourism, and radiation monitoring all became part of the city's afterlife. The apartments people imagine as untouched evidence are, in many cases, spaces altered by time, visitors, contamination, and weather. That later history complicates every photograph and every claim. It also explains why Pripyat continues to attract stories. The rooms are not only abandoned, they have lived a second life as symbols, warnings, destinations, and screens onto which people project what they fear might still be waiting inside. That second life is where the apartment camera claim becomes harder, not easier, to handle. A room in Pripyat may look like a sealed container of 1986, but the visual impression can mislead. The city was emptied in an emergency, then placed inside a restricted landscape, then left to weather, human intrusion, state control, and public fascination. By the time a modern viewer sees an image from inside one of those flats, the room has already passed through decades of change. This matters because the claim depends on the idea of recovery. A camera is supposedly found, or a recording is supposedly retrieved, or an image is supposedly connected to a person missing since 1986. But in a place like Pripyat, the question is never simply, what does the frame show? It is also, where has the object been? Who had access to the room? What happened to the building after evacuation? Was the interior protected, disturbed, looted, staged, contaminated, monitored, or entered by visitors? The more carefully those questions are asked, the less the city behaves like a clean crime scene. The research notes give us a quieter and more complicated afterlife. They do not confirm the camera story. They do confirm that Pripyat's abandoned apartments became part of the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, a restricted landscape of apartment buildings, public structures, roads, forests, former settlements, industrial infrastructure, and contaminated sites. That is not just scenery. It is a system of control, danger, memory, and access. The rooms were no longer only private spaces. They became regulated spaces, photographed spaces, rumored spaces, and eventually, tourist spaces. The first change was physical. Buildings age whether people live in them or not. Roofs fail. Windows break. Moisture enters. Paint peels. Floors weaken. Dust settles. Metal surfaces corrode. In Pripyat, decay was not separate from contamination concerns because radiation danger in the zone is not always visible. Chernobyl literature discusses radionuclide including iodine-131 and cesium-137, and the notes remind us that walls, dust, soil, moss, basements, and metal surfaces may carry different contamination histories. An apartment could appear ordinary in a photograph while still belonging to a monitored, contaminated environment. That invisible condition changes how we should read every image. In an ordinary abandoned building, a viewer might ask whether a room is unsafe because of rot, collapse, mold, or trespass. In Pripyat, those risks are layered with the history of radioactive material released from Reactor Unit 4 after the explosions and fire of 26 April 1986. The point is not to imagine every object is glowing or every hallway is deadly. That would be another form of distortion. The point is that the place requires measurement, context, and caution. Radiation monitoring matters because the danger does not arrange itself for the camera. The second change was human. The notes referred to looting, and that single word is enough to disturb the common fantasy of Pripyat as perfectly preserved. People often describe the city as if every chair, cup, toy, book, and coat remained exactly where evacuation left it. Some spaces may still contain traces of sudden departure, but the broad idea of untouched domestic evidence is unreliable. Objects can be removed. Objects can be moved from one room to another. Doors can be forced. Cabinets can be opened. Apartments can be stripped. In a city of roughly 13,500 flats and up to 30,000 rooms, there is no single condition that describes every interior. Looting also affects interpretation. If a photograph shows an empty shelf, that emptiness may mean evacuation, removal, decay, or later intrusion. If a room shows personal objects, they may be original, displaced, arranged, or preserved by chance. If a camera or recording device were said to appear in such a room, that object would need a chain of explanation. It would not be enough for it to look old, or to be filmed in a dramatic setting, or to be surrounded by peeling walls and abandoned furniture. In an altered environment, appearance is not provenance. The third change was public attention. Pripyat became one of the most recognizable abandoned urban symbols in the world. For many English-speaking audiences, it is known through documentaries, dark tourism videos, disaster history, Cold War memory, and dramatizations such as HBO's Chernobyl. Those forms of attention are not all the same. Some try to explain the accident, the evacuation, and the long-term consequences. Others use the city as a forbidden backdrop. But together, they have trained viewers to read Pripyat visually. Apartment blocks, empty windows, broken schools, silent roads, and interiors where ordinary life seems to have stopped mid-motion. That visual language is powerful, and it is not invented from nothing. Pripyat really was a modern Soviet city near the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. It really was evacuated on 27 April 1986. It really did contain a large residential interior world. It really did become part of a restricted zone. But public fascination can flatten those facts into a simpler image, the city where time stopped. Once that image takes hold, unsupported claims can attach themselves to it easily. The audience has already accepted the mood before the evidence is tested. This is one reason forbidden places produce durable rumors. Restricted access creates gaps. Gaps invite speculation. When a city is controlled, contaminated, and partly inaccessible, most people cannot verify what they see. They rely on footage, photographs, guides, visitors, archives, officials, and secondhand accounts. A corridor becomes not only a corridor, but a place the viewer cannot casually enter. A closed apartment becomes not only a closed apartment, but a possible container for withheld truth. The forbidden quality changes the emotional temperature of ordinary evidence. Tourism added another layer. The notes do not ask us to treat Pripyat as a supernatural site. They describe it as a restricted, contaminated landscape with documented human, environmental, and political history. But over time, the exclusion zone also became a destination for visitors under controlled conditions. That meant more cameras, more images, more online circulation, and more opportunities for interiors to be framed as discoveries. A room could be photographed thousands of times and still be presented to a new viewer as if it had just been opened. A familiar stairwell could look like fresh evidence when edited into a suspense sequence. The problem is not that all visitor images are false. The problem is that visitor images are rarely enough by themselves. Some photos and videos of Pripyat interiors are staged, moved, looted, or altered by visitors, according to the uncertainty notes. That warning is crucial for an archive report. It tells us not to assume that every object in every frame has remained in place since April 1986. It also tells us not to convert a striking image into a verified story without asking where it came from, when it was taken, who controlled the scene, and what documentation supports it. The city's environmental afterlife complicates the picture further. Ukraine established the Chernobyl Radiation and Ecological Biosphere Reserve in 2016, 30 years after the accident. That institution shows that the contaminated territory cannot be described simply as dead, empty, or abandoned. It has also monitored ecological space. Forests, former settlements, industrial remains, and wildlife habitats exist within a landscape still marked by the disaster. This does not erase the human loss of Pripyat. It widens the meaning of the zone. A place evacuated because of technological catastrophe became, over time, an object of scientific, environmental, and administrative attention. That shift matters for the way we think about rooms. The apartment blocks are not isolated haunted structures. They sit within a larger managed territory where radiation monitoring, access restrictions, environmental change, and political history intersect. The abandoned interiors are part of that territory, not exceptions to it. Their meaning comes from the evacuation, but also from everything that happened afterward: the years of exposure, the movement of objects, the presence of visitors, the official controls, the contamination studies, and the broader transformation of the exclusion zone. This is why the missing man recording claim should not be strengthened by Decay. A damaged room does not make a story more factual. A forbidden address does not replace a named person. A camera found in an apartment, if such a claim is made, would still need records around it: identification, custody, dating, technical analysis, and official connection to a missing person file. Without those, the room provides atmosphere, not confirmation. And yet the atmosphere remains understandable. Pripyat's rooms carry the emotional weight of interrupted domestic life. They suggest meals not finished, beds not returned to, corridors no longer crossed by neighbors, windows looking out over a city whose purpose vanished almost overnight. The later decades did not erase that weight. They layered over it. Looting changed some rooms. Decay opened others to weather. Tourism turned interiors into images. Monitoring placed invisible measurements over visible walls. The result is not a frozen city. It is a city whose abandonment continued to evolve. That evolving abandonment is enough. It does not need an unverified recording to be unsettling. The verified story already contains sudden evacuation, restricted territory, contamination, thousands of emptied flats, and decades of unresolved visual memory. The danger of the camera claim is that it tries to narrow all of that into one sensational discovery. But Pripyat's afterlife is larger than a single frame. Its rooms do not point only toward one possible missing man. They point toward a much wider displacement, one that reached beyond the apartment blocks, beyond the city limits, and across contaminated areas where many more people were forced to leave home. If the apartment rooms point outward, they point first to the limits of Pripyat itself. The city became the image most people remember: the high-rise blocks, the empty schools, the roads that seemed to stop in mid-thought. But the evacuation story was never contained by those buildings. Pripyat was the symbolic center because it was so close to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and because its abandonment happened with such visible force. It gave the disaster an urban face. Yet the larger displacement extended across contaminated territory, through settlements and rural districts, through places that did not become as internationally famous, but were still pulled into the same emergency geography. That is where the scale changes. According to major nuclear safety summaries, about 115,000 to 116,000 people were evacuated in 1986 from the most contaminated areas. The exact figure varies slightly by source and counting method because the disaster did not respect one simple municipal boundary. Some summaries count the initial zone. Others describe broader affected territory across Soviet administrative lines. But the range itself is important. It tells us that the evacuation of Pripyat, even with about 45,000 to nearly 50,000 residents removed, was only part of a much larger removal of people from places judged too contaminated for ordinary life. The apartment camera claim depends on a narrow frame: one room, one device, one man, one impossible sighting after 1986. The evacuation record forces the frame open. It asks us to think not only about a missing person, but about entire communities displaced by a technological disaster. It asks us to look beyond one corridor and imagine roads filling with buses, checkpoints forming around territory, settlements being sorted by measurements and decisions, and families learning that the space between home and exile could be drawn by invisible contamination. The most recognizable boundary in public memory is the 30-kilometer zone around the damaged plant. Earlier, that boundary helped turn ordinary urban and rural space into restricted territory. But as an evacuation category, it should not be imagined as a clean circle on an empty map. Within and around that area were apartment buildings, public structures, forests, villages, roads, industrial sites, and the older town of Chernobyl itself. Pripyat was young, purpose-built, and closely tied to the plant. Chernobyl was older. Villages in the affected region had their own histories, their own cemeteries, kitchens, wells, gardens, and seasonal rhythms. When radioactive material was released from Unit 4 into the atmosphere, the consequences spread over lived landscapes, not abstract zones. That distinction matters because Pripyat's emptiness can make the disaster seem almost architectural. We see the apartments and we understand absence through walls. We see schoolrooms and stairwells, and we understand interruption through objects. But displacement beyond Pripyat was also agricultural, familial, administrative, and environmental. It moved through settlements where homes may not have resembled the modern apartment blocks of the plant operator's town. It affected people whose relationship to the land may have been older and less easily replaced than an assigned flat in a Soviet residential district. The result was not one abandoned city, but a pattern of removals across contaminated areas. The research notes give a second figure that is even larger. After the 1986 evacuations, a further 220,000 people were relocated in subsequent years from contaminated areas, according to a United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission summary citing UNCRER. That later relocation is crucial because it shows that the disaster did not end as a single evacuation order. It became a long administrative and human process. The first removals came under emergency conditions. Later decisions came through continued assessment, radiation monitoring, changing knowledge, and policy responses to contamination that could not be seen with the naked eye. For a true crime-shaped internet story, time often works like suspense. Someone disappears in 1986. A camera appears decades later. A recording seems to collapse the years. But in the verified history, time works differently. It stretches. It extends the disaster beyond the night of the explosion, beyond the day Pripyat was evacuated, beyond the first boundary around the plant. The later relocation of about 220,000 people tells us that the disaster's social footprint kept widening after the initial emergency. People did not simply leave once and vanish from the record. They were counted, moved, resettled, and remembered through official categories that could not capture all of what leaving meant. The figures can sound impersonal because they are so large. 115,000 to 116,000 people in 1986. 220,000 more in subsequent years. But these numbers are not abstractions. Each one stands in contrast to the smaller domestic details that make Pripyat so visually powerful. A coat left behind. A cup in a kitchen. A hallway with peeling paint. A children's room turned into a photograph. Multiply that kind of departure across contaminated settlements, and the story becomes less about one city frozen in time and more about a region whose ordinary map was broken. This is also why Pripyat became such a strong symbol. It could stand in for something bigger than itself. Its apartment blocks gave viewers a way to see displacement. Its streets provided a visual shorthand for the consequences of Unit 4. Its emptiness was legible. A modern city without residents is immediately disturbing. But symbolic power can also distort. It can make the larger evacuation seem secondary, as though the rest of the affected territory were only a background to the famous ghost city. The records push against that simplification. They show that Pripyat was central, but not solitary. The term most contaminated areas carries a quiet severity. It suggests decisions based not on visible destruction alone, but on radioactive material released into the environment. Explosions and fire destroyed the reactor building at Unit 4 and sent radioactive material into the atmosphere. Afterward, danger was mapped through measurement, monitoring, and scientific assessment. This is part of what makes the Chernobyl displacement different from an evacuation caused by a conventional fire, flood, or military bombardment. In many cases, the structures remained standing. Roads still existed. Some houses may have looked undamaged. Fields and forests still appeared recognizable, but the conditions for ordinary residents had changed. That invisible quality is one reason unsupported stories attach so easily to the zone. When danger cannot be fully seen, imagination supplies images. When access is restricted, gaps become invitations. When people know that thousands were removed quickly and many more were relocated later, the mind searches for singular stories that can hold the weight of the mass event. A missing man in an apartment camera becomes a compact version of something too large to absorb. It turns population movement into a face. It turns contamination into a room. It turns bureaucracy into a mystery. But the responsible archive has to resist that compression. Not because the emotional need behind it is false, but because the documented displacement is already profound. The absence of a confirmed missing man case does not empty the story of human loss. It redirects attention toward losses that are recorded at scale: evacuated cities, restricted villages, relocated families, abandoned infrastructure, and contaminated landscapes that remained under supervision long after the first emergency passed. In this wider context, Pripyat is not less important. It becomes more precise. It is the place where the suddenness can be seen most clearly. The operator's town, only a few kilometers from the plant, emptied the day after the explosion. But it sits inside a larger history of movement from danger, and that movement did not end at the edge of its apartment blocks. The same disaster that emptied those flats also reshaped territory across northern Ukraine and beyond, affecting areas connected by fallout, administration, and fear. So when we return to the image of an apartment interior, we should hear the larger silence around it. Not only the silence of one staircase, but the silence of roads that led away from many settlements. Not only the missing sound of one family returning to one flat, but the accumulated absence of communities that were moved because the land itself had become uncertain. The symbolic city helps us understand the disaster, but it should not be allowed to contain it. And once the lens has widened that far, another complication begins to appear. The restricted landscape was not only abandoned, it was also monitored, managed, studied, and transformed over time. The same territory that holds the memory of evacuation later became part of an environmental story as well as a disaster story. Forests, former settlements, wildlife habitats, contaminated industrial sites, and official institutions would all become part of the zone's later identity. The map of loss did not stop changing when people left. That changing map is where the exclusion zone becomes harder to describe in simple terms. It was never only a blank space around a ruined reactor. It was a restricted landscape created by disaster, but over time it also became a managed territory, a place where abandonment, contamination, study, memory, and ecology all overlapped. This matters because the popular image of Pripyat can make the whole region seem frozen. One apartment, one corridor, one doorway, one camera angle. The internet claim depends on that feeling of suspension, as if the zone is a sealed room and every object inside it might still be waiting to reveal a secret from 1986. But the actual territory around Chernobyl did not remain still. It changed under state control, under radiation monitoring, under weather and forest growth, under the movement of animals, under the decay of buildings, and under the continuing presence of contaminated industrial sites. 30 years after the accident, Ukraine established the Chornobyl Radiation and Ecological Biosphere Reserve. The year was 2016. By then, Pripyat had already spent 3 decades as the most recognizable abandoned city connected to the disaster. The Chornobyl nuclear power plant, Reactor Unit 4, had already passed through its first era of emergency response and sheltering. The restricted zone had already become part of international disaster memory. And yet, the creation of the Biosphere Reserve showed that the landscape was not being understood only as a place where life had ended. That is the complication at the center of this chapter. The zone is a disaster landscape, but it is also an ecological one. It contains abandoned urban structures, former settlements, forests, wildlife habitats, roads, industrial infrastructure, and contaminated sites. It is not empty in the simple sense. It is emptied of many of the people who once lived there, and that absence remains the moral center of the story. But absence of residents is not the same as absence of activity, change, or meaning. The word reserve can sound almost peaceful if it is separated from its history. It can suggest protected forest, managed habitat, field research, and environmental monitoring. In the Chernobyl context, it carries all of that weight, but it also sits beside a different vocabulary: explosion, evacuation, radioactive material, restricted access, contaminated soil, abandoned apartments, and a damaged reactor building. The Chornobyl Radiation and Ecological Biosphere Reserve does not erase the disaster. It exists because of the disaster's aftermath. The reserve's establishment in 2016, 30 years after the accident, marks a long transition in how the territory was officially framed. In the first days and months after Reactor Unit 4 was destroyed, the urgent questions were immediate ones: fire, radiation release, evacuation, exposure, public safety, and control of access. Pripyat was evacuated on 27 April 1986. Wider evacuations removed about 115,000 to 116,000 people from the most contaminated areas in 1986, with further relocations in later years. Those movements created the human geography of loss. But after people were moved, the land remained. Forests did not disappear because municipal life stopped. Roads stayed in place, even as traffic changed. Villages and apartment blocks remained as structures, even as homes. Industrial sites remained as hazards and engineering problems. The damaged Unit 4 was first covered by the Soviet-era shelter, often called the sarcophagus, and later by the new Safe Confinement Project. Around those visible signs of human intervention, other processes continued more quietly. This is one reason the zone resists the language of a ghost town. Pripyat may appear ghostly in photographs, but the broader restricted territory is not a single city and not a single mood. It is a mosaic. There are former settlements where people once had ordinary routines. There are wooded areas where the return or movement of wildlife has become part of the zone's public identity. There are industrial locations connected to the plant and to the management of contamination. There are roads and checkpoints that remind visitors and workers that access is controlled. There are monitoring practices because radiation danger is not always visible to the eye. The reserve brings those layers into one institutional frame. Its name itself holds the tension: radiation and ecological. One word points back to the release of radioactive materials after the explosions and fire at Unit 4. The other points toward living systems, habitats, and environmental study. Neither word cancels the other. Together, they describe a territory shaped by catastrophe and by the long aftermath of catastrophe. For a true crime-style claim about an apartment camera, this matters in a particular way. A rumor can make the zone feel like a stage set for one hidden event. It can reduce the place to suspense: a lens, a figure, a missing man, a sealed flat. But when we look at the actual post-accident landscape, the story becomes much larger and less tidy. The zone was not simply abandoned and then left untouched until someone found a shocking recording. It became a restricted and monitored territory where different forms of official attention continued. That does not mean every space was carefully preserved. Earlier, we looked at how looting, decay, tourism, and weather complicated the idea of untouched rooms. The Biosphere Reserve adds another complication. It asks us to think beyond interiors. What happened in Pripyat's apartments is only one part of the zone's afterlife. Outside the buildings, land that once supported settlements became part of a new environmental and administrative reality. The scale shifts again, from room to block, from block to city, from city to evacuation zone, and from evacuation zone to a monitored biosphere reserve. This shift does not soften the disaster. It can, in some ways, make it more unsettling. A dead city is easier to imagine than a living, contaminated landscape. A dead city belongs to one category. A living contaminated landscape belongs to several at once. It is a memorial, a warning, a field site, a restricted territory, a habitat, and an industrial legacy. It contains growth and danger together. It contains evidence of human absence and evidence that non-human life did not wait for the story to become simple. The Chernobyl Exclusion Zone's forests are often central to this changed perception. In public imagination, forests can stand for recovery. But here, recovery cannot be treated as a clean reversal of harm. The research record reminds us that Chernobyl literature discusses radionuclide such as iodine-131 and cesium-137, and that contamination histories vary across surfaces and locations. Soil, moss, basements, metal, roadsides, and building interiors do not all tell the same story. A landscape may look green and still carry invisible histories from 1986. That is why monitoring matters. The zone is not dangerous in the theatrical way that horror stories often suggest, where danger announces itself through darkness or decay. Its hazards may be uneven, technical, and invisible. They require measurement, maps, rules, and institutional knowledge. The reserve exists within that world of managed uncertainty. It is not a return to normal nature. It is an official acknowledgement that ecology continued inside a territory that still had to be understood through radiation and restriction. This helps explain why the phrase "forbidden places" can be misleading if it is used too casually. Forbidden does not mean forgotten. Restricted does not mean unobserved. Empty does not mean simple. In the Chernobyl zone, prohibition and attention have existed side by side. The same roads that became inaccessible to ordinary residents could be used by workers, researchers, officials, or monitored visitors under particular conditions. The same places that looked abandoned in photographs could be part of a wider system of control, study, and memory. The apartment camera claim gains emotional force by leaning on the silence of Pripyat's interiors. But the reserve shows us that the silence was never the whole story. The area around Pripyat continued to be named, mapped, administered, and reinterpreted. It became a place where Ukraine's disaster memory and environmental policy met in the same landscape. It became a territory where the consequences of a nuclear accident were not only recorded in abandoned furniture or cracked plaster, but also in boundaries, institutions, habitats, and long-term monitoring. There is also a deeper ethical point here. When we call the zone empty, we risk erasing the people who were removed from it. When we call it dead, we risk misunderstanding the ecological reality that followed. When we call it a mystery, we risk letting unsupported claims overshadow documented displacement, contamination, and institutional history. The truth is more difficult than any of those words alone. The region is marked by absence, but not by nothingness. By 2016, the establishment of the Chornobyl Radiation and Ecological Biosphere Reserve made that difficulty official. The zone was not just a perimeter drawn after an accident. It had become a long-term landscape of consequences. Pripyat's apartment blocks still mattered, but they were now part of a larger terrain: forests, former settlements, wildlife habitats, contaminated industrial sites, and the continuing presence of the plant itself. The camera story, if treated as fact without evidence, narrows the zone into a single dramatic corridor. The reserve widens it again, and widening the view changes the way we listen to every claim that comes from this place. It reminds us that Chernobyl is not only a setting. It is a name carried through archives, languages, political histories, scientific reports, and public memory. Even the spelling can tell us something about how the disaster has been recorded and retold. The landscape is layered, and so is the language used to describe it. That layered language is not a small detail. It changes how the story is framed before the evidence is even examined. For many English-speaking audiences, the disaster is still most familiar under the name Chernobyl. That spelling appears across older English-language reporting, Cold War histories, scientific summaries, television titles, and archive descriptions. But the Ukrainian spelling, Chornobyl, is now often used to reflect the place as part of present-day Ukraine and to move away from the older Russian-derived form that entered so much of the international record during the Soviet period. Both forms point toward the same place. Both are recognizable in English, but they do not carry exactly the same historical weight. In 1986, Pripyat and the nuclear power plant were in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic within the USSR. The accident at Reactor Unit 4 was recorded by Soviet institutions, interpreted through international nuclear safety bodies, and later retold through English-language archives that often used the Russian-derived spelling. For decades, many readers outside the region encountered the disaster first as Chernobyl, not because that was the only name the place had, but because that was the form that traveled most easily through official translation, media repetition, and Cold War-era reporting. Today, Chernobyl has become more common in many English-language discussions that are attentive to Ukrainian geography and political context. It sits alongside Kiev rather than Kiev, and other place name changes that ask English speakers to notice whose language has been treated as standard. The difference is not just pronunciation. It is a reminder that the disaster was never only a technical event at a reactor. It happened in a particular country, in a particular political structure, to communities whose names were filtered through the power systems that documented them. This matters for our claim because viral stories often depend on familiar words. A title that says Chernobyl may immediately call up a set of images for an English-speaking viewer: gray apartment blocks, empty schoolrooms, gas masks, rusted amusement rides, a sealed reactor, and a forbidden zone. Some of those images come from real places and real records. Others have been shaped by documentaries, tourism footage, staged photographs, dramatized television, and internet retellings. The spelling itself can become part of that atmosphere. Chernobyl sounds to many people like an established archive category. It feels already documented, already known, already proven. But familiarity is not the same as verification. The older spelling can make a rumor feel archival, even when the rumor has no file behind it. If a video title claims that an apartment camera recorded a man missing since 1986, and it places that claim in Chernobyl, the audience may feel that the word itself supplies credibility. The name carries disaster authority. It carries the memory of Reactor Unit 4, the evacuation of Pripyat on 27 April 1986, the restricted zone, the apartments, the radioactive contamination, and the international scientific attention that followed. Those are real anchors. The problem begins when a new claim attaches itself to those anchors without producing the records that would make the claim real. That is why language and evidence have to be kept close together. Chernobyl, as a present-day Ukrainian spelling, points us back to the actual geography: northern Ukraine, Kiev Oblast, near the Belarus border, with Pripyat only a few kilometers from the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Chernobyl, as the older English archive form, points us to the way the disaster was entered into global memory, through translated Soviet-era documents, international agency summaries, nuclear safety reports, news archives, and later cultural representations. Neither spelling solves the mystery. Neither confirms the apartment camera story. But each spelling shows how memory can be organized before the facts are checked. Archives do not only preserve information, they also shape the path by which information is found. If a researcher searches under Chernobyl, they may find one layer of English-language material. If they search under Chornobyl, they may find another, especially in more recent Ukrainian or Ukraine-conscious contexts. If they search for Pripyat, they enter a still narrower field: the plant operator's city, the apartment blocks, the evacuated residential landscape. If they search for Reactor Unit 4, they enter the technical history of the accident. If they search for the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, they enter the administrative and environmental afterlife of the territory. Each term opens a different door. Each door leads to a different type of record. A true crime claim needs more than an evocative door. It needs a named person. It needs an official missing person record, or a police file, or a court document, or an agency statement, or a credible archival source connecting that person to the alleged apartment footage. It needs dates that can be tested against the known history of evacuation, restricted access, and later monitoring. It needs some explanation for the camera itself. What kind of camera, where it was installed, who recovered it, who authenticated the footage, and which authority preserved or released it. Without those details, the claim remains a story about Chornobyl or Chernobyl, not a documented case from the place itself. This distinction becomes especially important because the disaster has been retold so many times through powerful visual shorthand. The empty apartment is one of the strongest images. A room in Pripyat can look like evidence simply because it is real. Peeling walls, broken windows, abandoned furniture, and long corridors do not need embellishment to feel heavy. They belong to a city whose residents were evacuated after the Unit 4 accident, a city with thousands of flats and tens of thousands of rooms. That reality can make even an unsupported story feel as if it has already been proven by the setting. But a setting is not a source. An apartment in Pripyat can prove that a city was evacuated. It can support the broader history of sudden displacement, long restriction, decay, looting, tourism, and radiation monitoring. It can help us understand why people continue to imagine hidden stories inside those buildings. It cannot by itself prove that a missing man from 1986 appeared on a camera decades later. The emotional force of the place is not the same as the evidentiary force of a record. This is where public storytelling becomes complicated. A disaster name can gather meanings over time until it becomes almost symbolic. Chornobyl can mean the actual plant and the surrounding restricted territory. Chernobyl can mean the archive category that many English speakers inherited. Pripyat can mean a real city, but also an image of evacuation frozen in public imagination. The exclusion zone can mean a controlled contaminated landscape, but also a genre of forbidden place video. When these meanings overlap, a claim can move quickly. It does not have to provide much. It only has to touch the right symbols. A camera in an empty apartment is one of those symbols. It suggests surveillance, secrecy, discovery, and a returned past. It gives the audience the feeling that the abandoned room has finally spoken. It seems to convert atmosphere into proof. But this is exactly why careful language matters. If we call the place Chornobyl, we are reminded that it is not only a cinematic ruin, but a Ukrainian place with a political and historical context. If we call it Chernobyl, we should remember that we are often moving through an older English archive, shaped by Soviet-era translation and international repetition. In either case, the name should not be used as a substitute for documentation. The most responsible archive report approach is not to choose a spelling and let it carry the burden of certainty. It is to explain the distinction, then return to the records. The records can tell us that the Chernobyl accident occurred on 26 April 1986. They can tell us that Reactor Unit 4 was destroyed after a loss of control during an improper low-power test, followed by explosions, fire, and the release of radioactive material. They can tell us that Pripyat was evacuated the next day and that the city's apartments became part of a restricted landscape. They can tell us that the disaster entered international memory under names that have shifted with language, politics, and time. They cannot, from the research available here, tell us that the apartment camera missing man story is true. That absence is not a technicality. It is the heart of the matter. The language of memory can preserve, but it can also blur. It can help English-speaking audiences find older reports, but it can also make old labels feel more authoritative than they are. It can honor Ukrainian naming, but it cannot turn rumor into record. It can explain why the claim feels believable, but it cannot supply the missing case file. So the name itself becomes a caution. Chornobyl, Chernobyl, Pripyat, the exclusion zone. Each term carries part of the truth, and each term has been used in public storytelling to create a mood. The final question is not only what happened in the apartment, because the available record has not established that such an event happened at all. The deeper question is what the record can bear, what the audience is being asked to assume, and why a single, unverified image can feel so powerful when it is attached to a real city emptied by catastrophe. That is where the record leaves us, not with a solved apartment case, but with a boundary. On one side is what can be supported. On the other is what the title asks us to imagine. The difficult work, at the end, is not to make the imagined part sound more official than it is. It is to let the boundary remain visible. The claim says an apartment camera recorded a man who had been missing since 1986. As a premise, it is immediately powerful. It gives the viewer a room, a device, a face, and a date. It suggests that a private space in Pripyat, sealed into the history of the Chernobyl disaster, has suddenly produced evidence. It feels like true crime because it seems to promise identification after decades of absence. It feels like forbidden place footage because it appears to come from inside a city that most people know through silence, restrictions, and ruins. But the research does not confirm that case. No reliable official source located in the research notes establishes that an apartment security camera recorded a man who had been missing since 1986. No named missing person is attached to the claim. No police agency, case number, court record, archival file, or credible official statement has been found here to connect a camera in a Pripyat apartment to a man missing since the year of the evacuation. That absence does not prove that no rumor ever circulated, or that no video was ever uploaded, or that no fictional version of the story was ever repeated. It means something narrower and more important for this episode. The claim cannot be treated as verified true crime. That distinction matters because the setting is real enough to carry the weight of the story without help from invention. Pripyat was not created by rumor. It was the plant operator's town near the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in what was then the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. On 26 April 1986, Reactor Unit 4 was destroyed after a loss of control during an improper low-power test, followed by explosions, fire, the destruction of the reactor building, and the release of radioactive material into the atmosphere. Major nuclear safety sources describe the disaster as the most serious accident in the history of the nuclear power industry. The next day, 27 April 1986, Pripyat was evacuated. Those facts are not vague atmosphere. They are the archive beneath the atmosphere. About 45,000 residents were evacuated from Pripyat on that day, according to World Nuclear Association reporting. Other scenario material gives the city population at the time as up to 49,360 people. However the count is framed, the meaning is the same. A modern city was emptied in an emergency. Its apartment blocks, stairwells, kitchens, corridors, balconies, and rooms were pulled out of ordinary life and placed inside a restricted landscape. That is the factual force the camera claim borrows from. The city contained about 520,000 square meters of apartment area, roughly 13,500 flats, and up to 30,000 rooms. Those numbers change the mental picture. Pripyat is not a single abandoned building with a single locked door. It is a residential world at scale. It is thousands of private interiors made public through disaster, then altered by time, looting, decay, tourism, radiation monitoring, and the complicated afterlife of a forbidden place. So when a story says, a camera in an apartment, the setting does half the work before the evidence appears. The listener can already see the corridor. The listener can already imagine the dust, the wallpaper, the empty room, the sense that someone left in a hurry and that the past might still be waiting there. The story does not have to prove much emotionally, because Pripyat's real history has prepared the audience to believe that something hidden might be found. That is why unsupported claims attached to real disasters can become so strong. They do not float in empty space. They attach themselves to documented suffering. The evacuation of Pripyat was part of a wider human displacement. About 115,000 to 116,000 people were removed in 1986 from the most contaminated areas, depending on the source and counting method. In later years, about 220,000 more people were relocated from contaminated areas. The accident killed 2 plant workers on the night itself, and 28 more emergency workers or plant staff died from acute radiation syndrome in the following weeks or months, according to major nuclear safety summaries. These are recorded losses. They do not need embellishment. They also do not make every later mystery true. The responsible question is not whether Pripyat is eerie enough to make the camera story believable. It is. The responsible question is whether the story has crossed from atmosphere into evidence. In this case, based on the research notes, it has not. A verified case would need to behave like a record. It would need names, dates beyond the borrowed date of 1986, a traceable authority, a documented chain between the missing person and the footage, a reason to believe the video came from the place claimed, at the time claimed, and showed the person claimed. It would need more than the general fact that Pripyat has abandoned apartments. It would need more than a frightening image, a caption, or the emotional pull of a city left behind. That does not make the story meaningless. It changes what the mystery is. The real mystery is the record. Why does an unsupported claim feel as if it belongs in the archive when it is placed inside Pripyat? Why does a vague camera become convincing when its frame is an abandoned flat? Why does the year 1986 act almost like evidence, even when it is only a date attached to a rumor? Why does the mind accept the missing case before it asks for the missing file? Part of the answer is that Chernobyl and Pripyat occupy a rare place in public memory. They are not only locations. They are symbols of disaster, secrecy, technology, evacuation, contamination, and unfinished return. The Chornobyl Exclusion Zone became a restricted landscape containing abandoned urban structures, former settlements, forests, roads, industrial infrastructure, contaminated sites, and later official environmental institutions, including the Chornobyl Radiation and Ecological Biosphere Reserve, established by Ukraine in 2016. It is a place where ordinary categories fail. City and ruin, home and hazard, archive and myth, human absence and ecological presence. In that kind of landscape, a small story can seem larger than itself. An apartment camera, if real, would be a modern object placed against a frozen historical backdrop. A missing man from 1986 would connect present footage to the moment of evacuation. The implied discovery would offer a kind of impossible return, someone lost to the year of the disaster reappearing in the private rooms that history closed. It is easy to understand why that image spreads. It gives shape to a grief that is otherwise too large and too dispersed. It turns thousands of abandoned flats into one room, tens of thousands of evacuees into one man, and a complex nuclear disaster into a single watchable revelation. But that compression is also the danger. Pripyat was not emptied so that later storytellers could use it as a blank horror set. It was a lived city, evacuated after a catastrophic reactor accident. Its interiors are not just scenery. They belong to people. Its silence is not supernatural proof. It is the result of a documented emergency, a restricted zone, contamination concerns, political history, and decades of managed access and memory. To attach an unverified true crime claim to that place without saying what is known and what is not known risks replacing real history with a more convenient kind of fear. The archive asks for patience. It asks us to hold two truths at once. First, Pripyat gives the story its power because the place is real. The Unit 4 disaster happened. The evacuation happened. The abandoned apartment world exists in the record. The exclusion zone became a real restricted territory, shaped by radiation monitoring, decay, study, and memory. Second, the missing man camera claim remains unsupported by the research used for this episode. It may be a viral invention, a distorted retelling, a fictional premise, or a claim whose evidence has not been produced. Without a named record, it cannot be presented as a confirmed case. That is not a weaker ending. It is the honest one. Because sometimes, the most important conclusion in a true crime-shaped story is not that a hidden file has been found. Sometimes it is that no file has been found, and that the absence itself tells us something about how stories move. A rumor can borrow the authority of a real disaster. A caption can borrow the silence of an abandoned room. A camera can borrow the grief of a city. And if we are not careful, the borrowed feeling begins to stand in for proof. So we return to the title differently than we first heard it. The apartment camera recorded a man who had been missing since 1986. Sounds like a discovery. After following the record, it reads more like a test. What can be verified? What is being implied? Who is named? Which institution confirms it? Where is the original footage? Where is the missing person file? Where does the archive end, and where does the mood begin? The answer, for now, is that the city is documented, but the case is not. And maybe that is the final responsibility of telling stories from forbidden places. Not to strip them of mystery, but to choose the right mystery. Not the false certainty of a man caught on a camera without a record to support it. Not the easy thrill of pretending that every empty room hides a solved crime. The more durable mystery is why Pripyat, decades after evacuation, still makes unproven stories feel possible. Why a real city, frozen by catastrophe and altered by time, can lend its silence to claims the archive cannot carry. In the end, the camera is not the strongest evidence in this story. The record is. And the record says this: Pripyat was real, the disaster was real, the evacuation was real, the abandoned flats were real. The missing man footage, as presented in the claim, remains unverified. Between those two positions is where the episode has to rest, quietly, carefully, and with enough respect for the past not to confuse its silence with proof.